Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Alhamdulillah, we got another live stream today. Inshallah, it's going to be a live stream more like a live review, inshallah. So we got, we don't have Brother Mansoor today, unfortunately, because he had some other commitments. So it's just the three of us for now. Alhamdulillah, we got our esteemed guest, Brother Subboor, Alhamdulillah, and also Brother Mohammed, mashallah. So, Brother Mohammed, do you want to just give a quick intro to the review, perhaps?
Bismillah, assalamu alaikum. So, assalamu alaikum, everybody. So I think the session today is going to be a little bit more of a discussion amongst us. And then what we'll do is we'll open up the session for you to join us with questions. And what I'd like to do is maybe kick off with a bit of a background narrative, Brother Subboor, with sort of how did we arrive at this discussion? Because I mean, really looking at the, let's say, the YouTube world, this seems to have been something that was going to happen, then didn't happen, was going to happen, and so can you maybe just sort of enlighten us in sort of how did we get to the discussion that actually happened? What was the build up?
Yeah, well, for some time, Peterson has been engaging with various audiences, and for some time recently he started bringing on some Muslim guests. So he brought on board one of the guys who was at Guantanamo Bay, and also recently he's launched an Arabic YouTube channel, also got his book 12 Rules for Life translated into Uzbek. That was done, and he was highlighting that. So he's trying to make inroads into the Muslim world, and he realizes there's a sizable Western audience who are Muslim, who are following his work, and also, well, he isn't actually known in the Middle East and the Muslim world yet, but that's there's something that he's trying to make headway there. In terms of this discussion, it was repeatedly delayed and then postponed because of health concerns. There's, I believe even now, I think he's still not 100%. I remember, there's some discussions happening off camera, and what I picked up is something. Yeah, I mean, it's. Yeah, I mean, he's struggling through. He's trying to do his best, but yeah, from the information that we have, he's not 100% anyway. He's still trying to struggle through.
So, in terms of background, obviously, I mean, he has quite a large following on YouTube. I think somewhere in the region of like 4 million plus subscribers. So he's clearly a celebrity on YouTube. What exactly is he known for? What are his credentials that make him the celebrity that he is on YouTube?
I mean, the long of it and the short of it is essentially he became a voice for the voiceless. He was a professor at Toronto, and there's many professors, many academics, as you know, and usually they're not really that well known. But what happened with him is that when he started taking on people who were trying to impose their worldview on him, and he felt, that he had to speak up, and he spoke up at quite a risk, because there was almost like a lobby against him. And then after that, he basically became famous, I believe, in his 50s, in his early 50s, and he's nearly 60 now. So he just took off from that point, and more and more people started listening to him. Basically, there is a silent minority, which is still a sizable minority, and some could say it's a majority, but whatever it is,
it's a big number, right?
A big number of people in the Western world who are against postmodernism, who are against constructivism, who are against these extreme egalitarian ideas, which are being churned out and imposed upon people. And there are people who want traditional values. There are people who see that this notion that truth is relative and it is what you make it, and this huge effort that's being put in terms of the culture wars to impose these ideas on the young audiences is having a backlash. People want some people want conservative values, some people they've had enough of this, and there was a lack of oxygen in terms of the freedom of speech, because if you spoke up, you were just considered a bigot, and postmodern ideas were imposed as literal truths upon people who really didn't want them. So when he started speaking up, of course, many of his ideas match ideas in Islam about, say, the nuclear family, traditional values, the roles of males and females, and these types of things. That's why he built up a sizable Muslim audience. That's what he's known for.
What was fascinating was when I first came across his work, it was actually within the context of what I would call executive training. So he seems to have quite a bit of an inroad into sort of executives, professionals that sort of look up to him as some kind of a balanced voice of reason in terms of balancing the idea of this pursuit of profitability, which is what they're all after, but also this as you know, this notion of we need to have a spiritual side to our sort of existence as well, and he seems to bring this almost without and we'll get to this later, almost without appealing to religion. Right.
I think that's a very good way of summarizing. Yeah, definitely.
Does he ever state what his religion is?
Not that I've heard. I mean, of the work that I've viewed online, he seems to have certainly a sensitivity to a Christian background, for sure. But again, I think professionally he's a trained psychologist, I believe. Is that his training?
He's a professor of psychology.
He's a professor of psychology, exactly. Yeah. So again, I think there is a certain element of where he needs to professionally maintain a distance because of the discipline that he's in, and and we understand that. I mean, we appreciate that. But there is clearly a soft spot that he has for some type of Christianity, and maybe possibly Catholicism. I don't know.
Yeah.
So, Brother Subboor, we invited you on. So, just for the audience, they may not know. Were you in any way involved in getting this discussion managed or arranged, or was there any kind of contribution that you made to the process?
Hijab has a whole bunch of brothers around him, including myself, who, and it's not just to do with the Peterson debate, David Wood debate, or any of his discussions. It's the same thing. With any major discussion or debate happens amongst the brothers, we all have these sessions where we sit down, we map things out, we look at, okay, what are we going to do here? And we have all these sort of back and forth sort of scenarios. But I would say what makes this slightly different is usually, when a discussion takes place, there's a level of preparation that the brothers do before these sort of debates or discussions. But I think Hijab takes it on another level. Like, he'll literally read every single thing, pretty much, which Jordan Peterson has written, including, journals and stuff. And then he'll also, go through pretty much every single video. So he'll literally do the best he possibly can to understand, his, the person that he's going to be interacting with. So, one of the things that we were discussing is, post, not post, before the actual discussion took place, is, things about, okay, so what is our main sort of thing? What do we want to get across? even though you have all these things you want to get across, because he's asking the questions in many ways, regardless of how much training you do or how many scenarios you prepare for, a lot of it can actually just be ad hoc. And the questions that were being asked, I mean, even for example, the answer that Hijab gave about civil war, and the Quran gives you a remedy to deal with civil war. I mean, that was, we spoke about this later. That's the first time he said it publicly. In fact, he said he just thought of it there and then.
Yes,
it's something that came to his head. So
and I think when we deconstruct the discussion, we'll go through this. But I think you mentioned a very important point there, which is, in order to be fair to the other side, it's important we extend the respect of understanding their work. And I think this is what Mohammed Hijab has done. He's genuinely gone out there, studied the published work of Dr. Peterson, and at least made the attempt to be genuinely fair in terms of representing the other side. And I think as Muslims, this is how we operate. This is what the approach is. I mean, there is no point in strawmanning the other side or assuming that they believe something they don't. And if they do, then it's published, then you can actually hold them, as it were, to that standard that they published.
Absolutely. And just to add to your point, Muhammad, Peterson's someone that likes to be challenged. But the person who likes to be challenged, like him, they want to be challenged upon their ideas, not your understanding of their ideas, but their ideas. And it's actually difficult to really get that. And one thing which did come across in the debate, you could tell he likes being challenged, but also that Hijab understood his ideas really well. And I think he appreciated that. You can tell.
And he made a very, very beautiful comment, I think, halfway through. So let's actually start the session now with...
Yeah, I was wondering when that's going to happen.
Yeah, so let's start the session with the opening. I was just waiting, because there's quite a lot of audience still joining. So I think we have a quorum now.
Just want to say wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh to all the people greeting. And please do share this stream. We are just at the beginning. And try to like and also subscribe to the channel. That'll be great. Inshallah, do subscribe to br.Subboor's channel as well. He's got, mashallah, quite an active channel, alhamdulillah, and on social media as well.
Alhamdulillah. Okay, so we have a great quorum, I think, now. So let's start with the opening comments, and let's see where we start with.
Hello, everyone. I'm pleased today to have as my guest discussant Mohammed Hijab. And this discussion has been postponed a number of times because of illness, and I'm very glad that we're able to do it today. And I thank him for his patience in continuing to pursue this and being willing to talk to me, despite, I think, being delayed 3 times, which is one more time than is unforgivable. But in any case, Mohammed Hijab is an author.
Let me sort of just stop there. So there seems to be a certain element of uneasiness as we kick off the program. Did you sense that, Brother Sabboor and Brother Hashim, while you were watching it?
I think it's like many people have been saying, he hasn't been well lately. It could be that. But yeah, I think there's obviously tension there. You can feel that.
Yes.
It's probably because of the back and forth on the Twitter thing.
Yes.
Not easy to come face to face,
Yeah, and what I would add, I mean, just on the opening sort of statement, the apology, and very genuine apology that he made, I think was very telling. It wasn't one that, okay, sorry, we did this. It was actually quite, I thought throughout the session, he was quite humble. Then I think he made a very interesting point. So let's sort of move forward.
Student of comparative religion and a philosopher of religion. He's the co-founder of Sapience Institute and is a researcher and instructor for that organization. He has a BA in politics and a master's degree in history. He's acquired a second master's in Islamic studies from the School of Oriental and African Studies. Hijab has also completed a third master's degree in applied theology from the University of Oxford, where he focused on the philosophy of religion in applied settings. He's now doing his PhD in the philosophy of religion on the contingency argument for God's existence. And many people, I was looking at...
So I have a question to both of you here. So there are some people who seem to think that explaining your credentials to people is somehow boasting. But there's a context where you can do this. And I think in this context, it was very important, I think, for the audience to understand that there is a certain level of intellectual respect that was being extended here. So I think reading that out and really with Dr. Peterson sort of stating it the way that he did, really, I think, establishes for us that these are two like-minded individuals that are coming to have a discussion. Because I did see some comments online that were saying, well, what does, hijab know or whatever it is. And I think, well, did you miss the introduction? Because Dr. Peterson was very clear. So the question is it boasting, Brother Sabur, to put your credentials out there like this or not?
I mean, we could just look into a well-known book in terms of popular psychology, the science of influence. The science of influence essentially talks about different traits which human beings look for when they want to be influenced or when they want to influence, and one of them is authority. So look, to be very fair, I don't need to do a PhD. Hijab doesn't need to do a master's. No one needs to do. No one has a monopoly on thinking, right?
Yes.
However, we as Muslims, we have to look at what works. So, I'm really interested in a topic, but if you want to excel in that and have the ability to engage with the opposite side, you have to have some form of a approval. And how else are you going to distinguish yourself from somebody who doesn't have that background?
Yes.
Now, at the same time, the credentials is something which we have to understand. That's why Peterson did well. From the perspective that he was a respected professor who got into trouble for challenging people in a very amicable way. But at the same time, I think something which is very important for us to understand is nobody has the right to dismiss somebody because of a lack of credentials. So just as an example, one of my favorite authors, Robert Greene, he, at the age of around 36, was somebody who had around 80 jobs, including a dishwasher and all these different types of jobs. And then he became an author, and he wrote the 48 Laws of Power. He wrote the 33 Strategies of War. He has absolutely no credentials, yet today he is cited by academics, and he's invited by, in fact, governments. He's actually spoken directly to governments, and I was just watching his talk earlier on today at the Oxford Union, and he has no credentials even today, around the age of 60, but his teachings are so profound that I think long after even he goes, academics are going to be studying him. So I think there's two sides of this. Your academic credentials are important to show that you know something, but it is not a necessary part of engagement.
Yeah. What I would add to that is, I mean, just from my experience, I think it's sort of what we call the ticket to enter the arena. If that is what is needed, but once you're in the arena, what wins out is your wisdom and the way you manage that knowledge.
Yeah.
And that's where actually the learning begins, not ends. Once you've acquired the credentials is where your learning begins, because it's not only learning, it's the application of that knowledge. It's the applied knowledge that really matters. Wonderful. Okay, so let's move on to the next piece. I've just skipped a few minutes here.
Thank you for having me, honestly. It's always a pleasure.
Well, so I'm going to ask some really basic questions, because it's very difficult to understand another culture from the outside. You also have, as an outsider, you have no idea how much you don't know about what you don't know. Even you're blind to your own ignorance. And so I'm going to start with basic questions. I wouldn't say that I have a tangible understanding of Islam. I mean, I have some understanding of Christianity. I've been able to get the sense of Christianity at a reasonably deep level, I would say, at least compared to other things I know. And I've kind of felt the same way about certain aspects of Buddhism and Taoism. But as a religious system, a system of thought, Islam has remained relatively opaque to me, despite the fact that I've done a reasonable amount of historical reading. And so what is it in terms of practice and belief that are absolutely core, as far as you're concerned, to practicing the Islam?
So can you just break that down for us? What he's basically saying is he's really quite vulnerable. He's admitting he doesn't know. He has a lack of knowledge, and he's also saying, "Look, I've done some research, but clearly it's not enough." And I think to open with that, for me personally, as I was watching this, I really said, this is somebody who is genuine. He really, I mean, on an open forum like this, in front of his audience, to say this, after, as you've said, having already had several Muslim speakers, at least from his perspective, educate him, he still feels he's sort of somewhat lacking. But what would you say, Brother Hashim?
Yeah, I mean, from what I've heard, I haven't watched many of Dr. Peterson's interviews and podcasts. From what I heard, this was the first time Dr. Peterson actually had an Orthodox traditional Muslim on his show.
Right.
So I don't know what type of the other Muslim guests were, perhaps from a liberal standing point of view, or some others, I don't know. But from what I heard from the people who have watched many of his podcasts, they say that this is the first time he has actually invited on someone like Brother Mohammed Hijab as a Sunni traditional Orthodox Muslim. Yes. So yeah, I think it's well, he does say, like you said, like he's not his experience in Islam and the knowledge about Islam is not that deep, might be superficial, but it's something, I think that's something that has happened, which should have happened a long time ago, like call a Muslim who's from a traditional point of view, Sunni Muslim, and he can perhaps, I don't know, quell some doubts that Peterson has about Islam. So inshallah, we'll know more of that as we progress during this.
Exactly, and
this podcast,
I think like most things, if you only learn from a source, a single source, then your learning by definition is biased, even if you don't intend for it to be biased. And we've all fallen foul to that ourselves, I'm sure. And it's one of the reasons where I think it's important to be curious, academically curious, to understand all sides, for sure.
Absolutely.
Which is what Brother Hijab demonstrated by doing the reading that he did. Let's just listen to the response that I think Brother Hijab gives to this, and then I'll bring Brother Subboor in, because I thought it was a very interesting position that he starts with.
Islamic
so let's
faith.
just get to the end of this.
Well, the first thing is I think we should start with the bare bones basics. And the bare bones basics is first to say that we believe in God. And the kind of God we believe in is one.
So what was the point of pointing out we believe in God? I mean, isn't that taken for granted?
I think why this is important is because later on in the discussion, and even the previous discussions that he's had about Islam, there's been discussions about ethics, injunctions, morality, the Islamic worldview, and it seems so obvious that it's not worth pointing out, but I think it is worth pointing out, because it isn't as obvious as we think it is, that all of these things are essentially derivatives from God. So later on we're going to see these discussions about Jesus and the Prophet, peace be upon him, and about Islam and Christianity and all of these types of discussions. And as we teach in the Ayara Dawah training course, the GORAP, right, you always go back to God's existence. It's always important to go back to God's existence. Yes. And also something I think which is worth highlighting is I definitely have not seen Jordan Peterson's videos and been through his books like Hijab has, and maybe some people in the comment section can correct me on this, but it seems pretty clear that he is ambivalent towards God's existence. God's existence is kind of like, from what I've seen of him, he's not firm that, okay, this is from God and this is what we believe in. It's more like, okay, belief in God is practically useful, and he mentions God in that perspective. Even the way he speaks about God is almost like a the way maybe Spinoza or Einstein would have referred to, in a very vague way.
Yes.
And I think
yes.
that's what hijab wanted to really establish, that look,
So,
we don't have
so
that.
exactly. So I agree. I think for me, what he was saying was, here is one of the key pillars of Islam, and let me start by saying we have this absolutely foundational belief in God, and that's where everything starts. And I think this is also a good dawah approach as well for us in general, which is, before you start having any conversation, we start with the assumption of belief in God. Okay, then the question has to be, why do you not believe in God? Because otherwise, and I think Jordan Peterson does it later on, when we bring the propositional logic argument into the discussion, he sort of says, well, okay, if you're doing this, then you're creating a falsifiable deity. And that I thought, to have put this pillar very early on by Mohammed Hijab, I thought was very smart, actually, to really start off with that foundation. So let's get to the end of this piece, and then we'll jump a few minutes and get to 5 or 6 minutes in, where we'll go to
I mean, to save time, we can skip the contingency argument, because we've all heard it before.
Yes,
and
exactly.
we can just skip to where where Peterson asks why bother with these arguments.
Yeah, so this was 14 minutes in. Let's move there. Around here. Okay, let's listen
Do
to this,
or don't. What do you believe, and how would you separate out that belief from what you term as worship?
Right. So actually, there's one thing that ought to be known, that in Islamic theology, we believe in something called the Fitra, which is an innate instinct to believing in God. And now, I'm not sure if you're aware of the work on it.
So why bother with the propositional arguments then?
It's
to me, they just seem like a side venture,
Good,
to argue
and
with
this is what
scientists.
some scholars have said that in Islam. Sorry, I apologize.
Yeah.
Pause.
Okay. No.
In fact, some modern day philosophers of religion have that kind of a stance, like Alvin Plantinga. He seems quite, agnostic about the whole thing. I mean, the thing is, what we're saying is, it would be committing something like the naturalistic fallacy to suggest that just because something is the case, or there is fallacy maybe, just because something is the case, that it ought to.
Could you, because he's moving on, there's 2-3 different things that were said.
Yes.
So we can finish off the discussion about what was said, and then Hijab's moving on to a totally different point now.
Okay.
So essentially what happened is, Hijab gave an argument for God's existence.
Right.
And Peterson basically said, why bother, right? And he wasn't saying in a condescending way. He's basically saying, your belief as a Muslim, and this is Peterson's assumption, that your belief as a Muslim is that you believe in God without a rational evidence. That's not to say the belief in God is irrational. It's just to say that you believe in God without rational arguments. So why bother with the rational arguments? And later on, we'll see why Peterson has that objection. So just on this point, maybe Hashim, you can give some of your thoughts as well. But yeah, this is what's basically going on.
What's interesting is when we say propositional, what he basically meant was, in the previous discussion, what he said, just because I can see some comments here, people saying, what exactly is propositional? Basically, it's a set of statements that we're making that are conditional. And if these sort of conditions are met, then that statement is true. And if they're all true, then the conclusion follows. Now, the risk with making an argument like this, because there is a risk, is that if your statement can be disproven, then your argument is disproven.
Yeah.
And from an Islamic perspective,
like a theory, right?
Exactly. So
you propose a theory.
You propose that, I expect this to happen, and if this happens, then that's true. And I expect this other thing to happen. If this happens, then that's true. And if both of these things are true, then the conclusion is it follows. Now, here's the challenge, and I thought it was a very smart challenge, was what Dr. Peterson was really saying is, if you are resorting to this kind of logical argumentation, then what is the point of starting off with belief if you need to justify it through argumentation?
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. Well
And
put.
and what was very important here was that if you listen to the argumentation, Mohammed Hijab did this after stating very early on, we believe in God.
Yes.
So he did not start with the propositional argument.
Yeah.
He actually, all it was doing, validating why I believe in God, because I already believe in God.
Yep. Absolutely. And this for Peterson was a contradiction.
Yes.
And the way that Hijab answers the contradiction in the following section is basically explaining that we have a natural inclination to believe in God, which he points out is the Fitra. However, for people who have doubts, right, whose Fitra is covered, and we've had plenty of discussions on this before, how the Fitra can be covered, then rational argumentations is a way of uncovering that Fitra. And this is something that some Islamic theologians have pointed out as well. However, what this goes to show is something which some Muslim scholars have been adamant about, and Peterson's probably never heard of them, yet he's resonating with their ideas. And what they're like, I'll give you an example of somebody who follows this line of thinking. In the Dawah, they basically said to me, look, Sabur, you ask questions like, do you believe in God, right? Or when you're giving Dawah, you're asking people. He said, why bother with the question? Because now you're making them feel like they have to give evidences for God, or they have to say yes or no. You should assume the conversation with the understanding that they believe in God and move on to something meaningful, like, where is God in your life, or what do you think God has given us as a purpose of life? So that's what that school of thought is what Peterson is alluding to, that we don't need to prove God's existence. We don't need rational arguments, propositions, and these things. And later on he'll explain why new atheists use that against us.
Yeah. So what's fascinating there, and I think I found it at this point, was also.
Sorry, brother. Can I just quickly let brother Sharif in?
Of course. Oh, yes, of course.
Yeah.
Yes.
Assalamu alaikum,
brother Sharif.
Rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Apologies for being a bit late. Sorry about that.
That's actually, you joined it just at the right time. We're about to enter the philosophical discussions right now.
Okay.
So perfect timing.
So it's for the viewers, just to let them know that we were expecting Brother Abbas and Dr. Imran, but due to certain commitment, they were unable to make it. So inshallah, Brother Yusuf Pondus might join us shortly. So yeah, stay tuned, and inshallah.
So what I find fascinating was that Dr. Peterson was astute enough to recognize this immediately. So clearly, I mean, what it says to me is he's done some deep thinking around this. Obviously, it's not something you arrive at in a mid-conversation. It's something he's really clearly thought about, and he picked up on it as soon as Brother Hijab mentioned that propositional statement by saying, "Well, why are you doing this?" And we'll sort of get to why he does this. So, where should we move to, Brother Subboor? Should we skip that piece, or should we listen to this piece?
No, this is really some juicy stuff, and I'd love to hear what Sharif has to say about this, because this is essentially, the crux of the matter, from the perspective that, as Peterson says, that if you make God into a proposition, or if you decide not to make a God into a proposition, and you believe in God intrinsically, then you're already accepting a certain definition of God. So things like these need to be broken down a bit.
He says that later on. Let me just sort of find where that is.
Maybe you can just play it from here.
Yeah. Okay, let's play from here then. Go on, 14.
Be the case. So in order to prove or it's a demonstrative proof for those who are in what we call shak or doubt. And this, but the truth is, as you've mentioned, and as in the literature, like for example, Justin Barrett has this in his cognitive psychological or cognitive science literature. I'm not sure if you've come across his stuff, but basically what he says is that we have an innate, his words exactly, receptivity to believing in God. In 2011, the Oxford Anthropological Society, they'd done a huge study of 32,000 children, and what they found was that children innately and intuitively, instinctively have a belief of a higher power of some sorts. Now, they are born with that belief. And in fact, in one of the papers in Justin Barrett's book, he literally mentions the Fitra, or the Islamic theological concept of an instinct in believing in God.
What's his last name?
Barrett.
How do you spell that?
I think R-T, I believe.
Justin Barrett. Okay, that's useful. Yeah, well, it just strikes me that you see, the problem with debating people like Richard Dawkins about the existence of God is that he will formulate the argument in propositional terms and then force the person, so to speak. I don't imply any malice on his part, but as soon as you accept that the battle is to be won on propositional grounds, you've already accepted a certain definition of God. And I think you lose the argument instantly. I think the argument for instinct, something like that, is much more powerful. Because one of the things I'm led to wonder when you laid out your argument is, well, what purpose does belief in God serve, or your faith in God, let's say? And I think belief, see, it's also really interesting to try to distinguish between belief in something and faith in something. Like if you imagine you have faith in the good. And so how do you demonstrate that? Well, you believe that good is more powerful than evil. You believe that you should act in a manner that's appropriate to the good. And so then you act that way. And that's the faith. The faith is demonstrated in the actions.
Yes.
But it's not exactly propositional. And, partly because I would say, if you look at good and evil, for example, it's not that easy to make the case that good is more dominant or more powerful than evil, all things considered, in human affairs. Now, I think it is, but you know what I mean? You can't make a compelling propositional case that that's absolutely true. But you can reflect your faith in your actions.
The thing is, you mentioned Richard Dawkins. I wrote, as part of the Sapience Institute, we wrote a small booklet called The Scientific Delusions of the New Atheists. And we refuted him on these kind of things. If you read the God Delusion, he literally spends 5 pages of hundreds talking about the cosmological argument. And I think 2 talking about the teleological argument, or the fine-tuning argument.
So let me stop that there. So clearly, I think Jordan Peterson has spoken to Dawkins, and clearly I haven't watched it. Have any of you brothers watched the discussion between Jordan and Dawkins? Do you know what happened?
No,
I saw it on YouTube. I didn't actually watch it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
did he mention something about good and evil being the same, or was that?
So I wanted to ask, sort of. So clearly, where is that coming from? This idea that is, because it's clearly not an Islamic perspective. Where is this? Because he wants to. I think what he wants to do is get to the idea of that love outweighs everything, which is a very Christian understanding.
Yeah,
you have to look at his epistemology, right? He's not. I mean, he's a pragmatist. For him, even getting into, does God exist or not exist is kind of irrelevant, even if it wasn't the way he described it, like we shouldn't make it propositional because it's innate or whatever. The fact is, what's relevant for him is what leads to human happiness, essentially, right?
Which is a very liberal attitude, of course.
It is actually, and later on we're going to see that they have a discussion on that. So essentially, his point is, people like Richard Dawkins would get you to treat God like a scientific hypothesis. It can be falsified, or you have to try and show that it's you have to sort of demonstrate that it's valid. And even if it's valid, it's still like up there, and it can be falsified at any time. And he's basically saying, well, we shouldn't have belief like that. Belief should be something that's free of that kind of limitation. So that's what he's really trying to say.
Yeah,
Brother
I would
Sharif,
like to
any
hear
comments on that?
Brother Sharif's.
Yeah, I think I agree with obviously what Subboor mentioned earlier in terms of the fact that Jordan Peterson is a pragmatist, and I think it's important to sort of understand Jordan Peterson's ideological political leanings, and then how it fits the idea of God and fits in religion and Christianity comes into that. So Jordan Peterson is of the right of the spectrum of liberal secularism or capitalism. So he holds this particular view. And historically, people like Edmund Burke, who is politician, political philosopher as well. He was critical of sort of the left, the Jean-Jacques Rousseau view of liberal secularism, which was to basically deconstruct whole of society and reconstruct it based upon liberal secular values in a radical way. What Edmund Burke said, he said, no, Western civilization is built upon some fundamental traditional values, such as Christianity, such as the belief in God, such as the belief that there are moral duties. Yeah. And so if you dispense away from belief in God and then try to deconstruct society, you are not going to be able to construct ideas about good, evil, morality, the types of institutions that exist within the West. And so what he says is that by undermining Christianity, faith in God, doing good, what is morally good, all these things, then ultimately undermining Western civilization. And for Jordan Peterson, he sees Western civilization as almost like the peak civilization that the world has now seen. It's created this great, technological, scientific advancement. And so to undermine some of these fundamental Christian ideas, irrespective of whether he believes in it, that's the whole point. Whether you can prove it or not is separate. It's the case that it's useful. That's the whole point. It's a pragmatic approach. And so that's why with Jordan Peterson, when he sees anything other than these traditional conservative, what he perceives as sort of, a Christian, Jewish sort of civilizational, basis, when he sees something other than that, he sees it as a potential threat. And I think that's where he starts to see Islam regards to this, that he sees it as the other, the potential to undermine this great, so-called great civilization of the West, is coming with different ideas and different civilization. Yeah. So I think that's just generally his background. Yeah.
Yeah. And also I think to be fair, I think his social conditioning, his nurturing that he's gone through, not just himself, but also, everybody who's been through this particular system, ends up with this kind of perspective on the world, on their worldview, because it's the only one they know, pretty much. And I think in the opening statement he made it very clear. He said, "Despite my best efforts, Islam remains opaque." Now I don't know what kind of efforts, obviously clearly, but what it goes to show is somebody who is intelligent, smart, and well educated, as Dr. B, and clearly open to new ideas, without actually learning from accurate sources, knowledge which is at the moment, easily available anywhere right now, given the internet, still remains elusive to him.
Yeah.
And which really sort of says, a couple of things about us. We're not delivering the message clearly, and we're not reaching out to people in the way that they can understand the message.
Yeah, but I would also say that I think the problem with some people within sort of the West is that they have their very fixed lenses, and it's very difficult for them to sort of, think outside of the paradigms that they view civilization and the West. And I think that's probably where Jordan Peterson has sort of had that struggle of trying to understand. That's why prior to, I think, Mohammed Hijab, and I think he had Mustafa Akyol as well on, prior to that, he's had basically ex-Muslims telling him what Islam is,
right.
Rather than actually going to the sources of Islam or speaking to people who practice and profess it and understand it at a good degree, like alhamdulillah now he's doing. So I think prior to that, obviously that's his paradigm, that's how he's viewing it. And like I said, he's coming from this paradigm that Western civilization's peak civilization, it was built uniquely from a Protestant, Christian, Northern, Western European perspective. And so anything that potentially undermines that could undermine capitalism, and therefore Islam or whatever other religion is put in the same bracket as a quote-unquote potential threat.
Yeah. Okay, good. So let's sort of move tactics again to another topic that he mentioned. I'm going to scroll forward a little bit here. Yeah. Go ahead with this one.
Just on that topic, I think it's worth, because what Sharif said, I think needs a bit more unpacking. So, Sharif spoke about, Rousseau and, why the traditionalist perspective is something that Peterson subscribes to sort of challenge that view. But if you can sort of explain, Rousseau's influence on, say, postmodernism now, and why then people like Peterson would be looking at Edmund Burke for inspiration, and so you can see that the two camps are coming down chronologically, historically.
And also, in this day and age with the internet, with lots of other resources, you don't really need someone to come on your.
Yeah, I mean, the question though is
Yeah.
which sources
Sorry,
do you
I thought
trust?
everybody froze there or something. That's why I stopped.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think what it boils down to is
Yeah.
sort of how do you know what sources to trust? And I think to the point that you made, I think it's quite obvious that this postmodern lens that he has, postmodern, which is deconstructing everything and then rebuilding everything, which is normal, which is the approach they take, but they still want to borrow from religion. And without, as you said, Brother Sharif, without actually proving it, which to me is actually a little bit disingenuous. If you think there's good in something,
Yeah, no, agreed. It is disingenuous.
then validate it.
Yeah, I was going to say it definitely is disingenuous. I think the issue. I think there's what's his name? A right wing anti-Muslim, anti-immigration in
Murray.
the UK. Douglas Murray. Yeah, Douglas Murray. He's an atheist, but he's a very strong advocate for Christianity. Christianity is like for the lay people. He wants people to practice Christianity because for him, even though he's an atheist, he thinks that if you undermine Christianity and people's adherence to Christianity, by default you undermine secular liberal capitalism that he believes is really good. So this is the way that they approach it. Now, obviously, I think we can say that secular liberal capitalism, however you want to coin it, the Western civilization and secular liberalism, I think you could say that really it isn't uniquely a Christian thing. I think it was a reaction to Christianity, not because of Christianity created these values, but a reaction to it. But I think what people like Nietzsche, and I know, if we get Joseph Ponders, he'll be able to explain it better. Yeah, but I'd also know Sabboor's had discussions and stuff on Nietzsche. But what people like Nietzsche explained is that by rejecting belief in God, you're basically foundationless when it comes to the idea of good and evil. Yeah. And that's the problem, is that do you really want to create a society in which the whole of society has no literal compass of what's good and evil? Yeah. And that's highly problematic. And that's where religion becomes useful in that context for them. Yeah.
And I think, Jordan picked up on this around sort of, I think here somewhere where he, after this statement. So let me sort of play it from here.
Yes, but in the Bible, you'll find some verses that are saying, I've only been sent for the lost sheep of Israel. And so
there's some tension. You see this, you see something like the rise of a universalism, a spirit of universalism that surpasses fundamental tribalism, even of a religious sort. But there seems to be a struggle that takes place in the gospel, in some sense, conceptually, between this reversion to something that's more tribal and something that's genuinely universal. But I think the universalist spirit wins out quite clearly. I mean, otherwise Christianity wouldn't be an evangelizing religion. It's designed to try to bring everyone under the fold. Let's say
tension. Sorry, it's largely because.
So again, here, even though he's, I don't know, is he Christian? Sharif, do you know? Or not?
Yeah,
he's
I think he's Christian. Yeah.
He is. Okay.
He is, but like Sabboor mentioned earlier, he's a Christian for more pragmatic reasons, more because it's this idea that the stories that we tell about our societies, the collective stories, they sort of shape our collective outlook as society. So for him, Christianity is this great moral civilizational story. Jesus is this hero figure, and so this story is something believed in, not necessarily proven, because it creates this collective consciousness as to what direction society should go in. So for him, he will defend it, but he, in essence, he's defending it from that point of view. He's not really that interested about whether you can prove it or not. Whereas obviously as Muslims, we're really important. We consider it's really important to prove our basis of belief. We're not going to just adopt any narrative about life, but we're going to adopt the correct one.
Sorry for interrupting. The fact that he felt he had to defend it at this point, I think, almost felt like, it was a defense, and it was a defense for, yes, but we are equally as sort of evangelizing and equally as universal, because Brother Hijab made a very strong point at that point, saying, Islam is for everybody. And so he was almost backed into a corner where he had to felt, and he says this later on actually from here, where I think he says, we'll get to it in a second, because he does bring up the point of Nietzsche, and he does bring up a couple of other points that we want to talk about. But if we just sort of spend, go ahead, Brother Subboor.
Yeah, just before that, I wanted to highlight why it's important for us to look at it from his conception of truth. So from his conception of truth, and this is something that will go throughout the entire discussion. So when we as Muslims, when we're speaking about truth, we are essentially believers in the correspondence theory of truth. So there's many different theories of truth. There's correspondence, coherence, pragmatic, and semantic theories, and redundancy theory, deflationary theories. So there's all these different things, and he is just somebody who, in a way, he's not interested in truth. He's interested in utility, which is why when it comes to something like this, where Hijab is pointing out that Christianity is not universal, and then he's trying to say, well, you see that tension there, and then it's very interesting. He says, but then you see that the universalists win out. So practically they win out. So you have to understand that is going to be throughout this discussion. It's about the pragmatic utility, and it even goes back.
But to me, this is post hoc justification. This is basically, well, it's now universal, therefore by definition it was good. There's no proof that it's good because it was already good to start with.
Yeah, so that's essentially the pragmatic dilemma, that they want people to accept the pragmatic view, but the pragmatic view can't be proven. It's just whatever is pragmatic. But yeah, I just wanted to highlight that point.
No, that was a good point. I get it, and I think the fact that he felt he had to defend it here is actually a tension that we see quite often in many discussions that we go through ourselves, which is when you get to a point and you state, look, Islam is the final revelation, and Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was sent for all of mankind. At that point, there is always this tension of, yes, but the Bible says, or the New Testament says, Jesus is universal. And I think in the next, because he brings up, I think, let me bring it here, where let's just, I think, is it? Yeah, so I won't play it, but Brother Hijab mentioned Isaiah 42:11, which is, I think, what really triggered that discussion. So what was the point of mentioning, Brother Hashim, Isaiah 42:11 in that previous piece? We haven't listened to it, but folks can go listen to that later.
I think the main point he wanted to drive there was the prophecy of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the last messenger, being prophesied in the book of Isaiah. And then he mentions specifically the location, which is in Medina.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the main emphasis, I think. He mentioned the Selah, the mountain Selah, and also the dwelling of the Kedar. And Kedar is the son of Ishmael, from whom the Prophet ﷺ draws his lineage.
Yes, and I think that really triggered this defense mechanism, because Muhammad Hijab provided, a propositional statement earlier. He then provided a biblical reference, and it got to a point where, okay, I now need to actually take a defensive position. And you could see that sort of cornering into there. But then it comes out of this, of course. So, and I really want to pick up on this one where he repeats again the divine spark statement. So again, remember, he mentioned it early on, and he mentions it again here. And I just want to pick up on why he does it again after having stated his position.
This is actually one of the clearest distinctions. Because
yes, but is there a clear distinction between the prophets and some spark of divinity inside those men?
Yeah. So what do we define as a spark of divinity?
Well, I would say it's partly what gives people charisma, although it's not always that. It's also partly what marked these men out as being prophets. I mean, it's what we look at when we say that man is great. That's a great man. That's a great person. That was a great deed. Well, yes, fair enough. But I would say also embodied virtue. And it's embodied virtue that is in some sense reflective of the action of the highest value operating at a local scale.
Yeah, so that's...
Is that a definition of divinity?
No.
Not really. In many ways, yeah, sorry.
No, I was going to say, I think for him, God is like an archetype. He's like the set of ideals. Yeah. And so when he says spark of divinity, what he's trying to say is these set of ideals manifest within an individual such that people will say, that's what we want to follow. That's the type of, virtue that we want to exemplify. Like I said, again, it's this very pragmatic approach. He's using language, religious language, but he's using it, I think, really metaphorically. Yeah. So that's what he's using it in that sense.
Yeah, his definition was way off, like saying it's just the virtue of the person, the fact that he's good, he's got good morals. I mean,
look,
atheists can have those virtues. You don't need to be even religious. Forget about anything divine in them. There are lots of good atheists out there.
Again, we have to go back to his pragmatic view. It sounds strange to us, his definition of divine spark, but from his perspective, that's exactly what it is. It's basically somebody who would be believing in God and therefore, in his words, embodying the highest values at the local scale. I mean, it's strange for us, but not from his perspective. He's being coherent. He's being internally coherent.
And that's actually a very good point to make out, which is just because somebody says this doesn't mean they are necessarily opposing our perspective, because in their logic they're coherent and they believe what they're saying is consistently follows from the propositions they've got in their head. The challenge, of course, is when we listen to this, we listen to it from a totally different worldview. And what we hear is, we hear words like, in the back of our mind, shirk. We hear words like disbelief. And we instantly almost take an antagonizing position. And it's important to understand this is not being deliberately done.
Mohammed, you make a very good point, because I think the issue is that you have to understand what Jordan Peterson means by the words that he's using. Jordan Peterson, in essence, he's using religious language to convey what he understands as secular virtues. But he's using these types of, he's trying to use these types of, terms like the spark of the divine, and it talks about the good and evil and sin, because for him, he sees this as all like a metaphor, in essence, to lessons that you can learn from, and you can understand and apply in order to live what he perceives as the good life. So I think you just have to be aware. So the way, natural reaction would be is, hold on, brother, Jordan or whatever, brother, hold on, brother, why are you talking about the spark of divine? You can't have, divinity within human beings. That's kufr, or that's, kufr or disbelief or whatever it is, And it's valid point to make, but you have to dig deeper in order to understand what he means by it. His position is still, I would say, incorrect. It might be coherent from his worldview, his logic, for him, but it's still incorrect. And I think it goes back down to and I think it's been mentioned by some of the brothers before, Sabur, Hashim, and yourself, which is it goes back down to how he approaches things. Yeah, his epistemology, how he values truth. Yeah, what he values truth for. Yeah, how he understands it. And I think that's where you sort of have to take a step back with somebody like Jordan Peterson, maybe talk about the importance of truth. How do we establish it? Why should we establish it? Is it just sufficient to be pragmatic about, what we call truth? It just works, therefore do it. Because for us Muslims, we have obviously Islam as a comprehensive way of life, a guidance from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that we understand intuitively accords to human nature. Yeah, whether that's as an individual or as a group of individuals, as a society as a whole, it accords. It's natural. It allows us to elevate ourselves. It gives us ideas about what is morally good, what is morally evil, how to live the good life, all of these things. But at the foundation of it is a belief system that can be proven. Yeah. So, yes, you may have this model that he might perceive as useful, but ultimately you have to say, well, yeah, but whether your model you think is useful or not, you still need to actually establish that the foundation of it is true. Because really, as human beings, it's not that we're just looking for a convenient story. We're looking for truth as human beings. Yeah. So, when people are sold some of the ideas about, what Jordan Peterson's saying about, how to, the rules of life and all these types of things, is because they believe it's true, not just because it's pragmatic. Yeah. And I think that's the idea. And I think that's probably where Jordan sort of slightly contradicts himself or refutes his own position, because ultimately he's pushing a position that he doesn't necessarily believe can be established rationally, or to at least a degree of conviction that a person who's rational would
But
be.
let me just be sort of counter propositional here. So, but from the pragmatist's perspective, they believe they don't need to justify it as long as it works.
Well, yeah. So but the problem that I have, or the problem that a lot of people would have, is that for example, when we turn around and say this is morally good, we don't say this is morally good because we're sort of what they call moral anti-realists. Yeah, we don't really believe morality exists. It's just something convenient in our mind that we make up. Like for example, different flavors of ice cream. Somebody likes vanilla, somebody likes chocolate. Yeah,
right.
We don't argue about what's morally good and morally evil on that basis. We believe that there is something that's moral. Yeah, whether we can arrive at it from our own mind or we need revelation, that's a separate discussion. But we believe there is something moral, that there is a true reality of, that we must adhere to, and that's what we're seeking towards. So we're not pragmatic in the sense that it's the most convenient way to live our life, or it works, but actually we think it's the truth. Yeah, and that's the reason why we believe it works. Yeah, or that's what we're trying to aim towards. And I think that's what maybe Jordan Peterson's whole approach, his epistemology, sort of breaks down slightly. And I think that's why Mohammed Hijab at the beginning, he was talking about the belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and about the Quran and how it rationally establishes it, and other things, because ultimately that's our foundation. Our foundation is to establish the belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The Quran is the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, whether it's through a Fitri approach or through intellectual rationalization or through looking at the text, the Quran and the Sunnah, and establishing that's from the divine authority or all together. Then all of this establishes for us a clear foundation, and then we can build upon that. Then we can talk about how it pragmatically affects human beings.
Exactly. And what I would add there, of course, I mean, given his Christian leanings, he clearly has also on the other side of his sort of understanding is this idea of it's this mysteriousness that I need to believe in, and I need to have this sort of blind faith approach to it. And so by definition, you must be coming from that position as well. Not understanding Islam because you already admitted it earlier. And I think this, I mean, I've seen this with many preachers and sort of evangelicals, where they will come to you and say, oh, we can all agree that, Jesus died for our sins. And we can all agree that, well, we can't, and we don't. And we have a completely different position. And I think that's the position he's coming from, which is, well, just agree with me, we have a divine spark in everybody, agree with me that love outweighs everything. He's using the sort of the preacher approach, but obviously in a slightly sort of more nuanced academic
he
approach
definitely
here.
has a bias towards Christianity. So even though he might not clearly state that he's a Christian, no, but he definitely comes from that background.
Yes.
And the same with Douglas Murray and all those people, because they come from that culture. So they will always be biased to that Christian culture.
Yeah,
Excellent.
and there was a famous, sorry, really quickly on that point,
Go ahead.
there was a famous German thinker called Max Weber. And Max Weber, he wrote a book. It's basically called The Protestant and the Work Ethic, something like that.
That's right.
Yeah,
the Protestant. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, and his argument was, well, hold on. Why did the industrialization process? I think he wrote it in the 19th century. Why did the industrialization process take place in Northern and Western Europe as opposed to Southern and Eastern Europe or other parts of the world? Yeah.
Right.
So his argument was that the Protestant, Christianity, so not Catholic Christianity, it's not just any form of Christianity, it's actually Protestant Christianity and Calvinism creates this sort of work ethic mentality that pushed and created the industrialization revolution within Northern and Western Europe specifically. Now, a lot of sociologists have looked at his work and said that it's flawed in terms of the data that he's used and some of the analysis, but that type of thinking still persists. That idea that why didn't the Chinese industrialize even though they invented writing a lot earlier is because they had Confucius philosophy, whereas Christianity and Protestant Christianity had a different type of view towards life. There are some merits in that argument, by the way. There are some merits, but it's not the full complete picture. But that now sort of exists today, which is this idea that Protestant Christian, Christianity, sort of what they call WASPs, isn't it? White Anglo-Saxon Protestant. Yeah.
Yes.
That
exactly.
is what created Western liberal secular societies. And so, if you detach it, Protestant Christianity, then you're basically going to potentially, undermine Western civilization or liberal capitalism, if you want to call it that way.
Yeah, I mean, the source of our success is the Protestant work ethic, and therefore we can't detach it because we'll then lose the source of our success. I mean, it's this sort of circular kind of reasoning, but and again, it's so deeply embedded in the culture that when it's like fish, you're born into water. You don't know you're born into water because the fish doesn't know water. It's just what it's born into. And I think in just to simplify it, when you're born into this sort of psychological outlook and worldview, you just take it as a given. That clearly this is what happened.
And the thing is this, and it's what's really interesting is that because they sort of assume that to be the case, they don't realize, for example, before the British colonized India, India was producing 27% of the world's GDP at that time. Yeah. After the British left India, so the whole process of colonization, India's GDP dropped to less than 3% of world's GDP. Yeah. It radically reduced. Now, this is a thing that people perhaps maybe in the Western Europe, from this liberal secular environment don't realize is the impact of colonization and imperialism in the latter part of the 18th and throughout the 19th century and even early parts of the 20th century had upon the rest of the world. Places like Bengal had deindustrialized.
Yeah, let's contextualize that as well, because you got to remember when we say India, the GDP. Remember at the time, most of the world at that time was underdeveloped. Which meant when we talk about the GDP of India, we're essentially talking about the GDP of the world, although the majority of it was going through this particular subcontinent, right? And when you go in there and you devastate essentially what is the growth factory or the growth engine of the world at that time, it is for no reason then that we had this massive almost degeneration of the revenue generating mechanism that was in that environment. And so when you look back and say, well, the the colonized world has now really sort of fallen behind, or it's not as powerful as it used to be. Well, how could it be when all of its wealth was sucked out and there was nothing to replace it when you left? I mean, simplistically, that's essentially what happened. And where did that wealth go? This wealth funded what essentially became the Protestant work ethic industrial revolution, because the whole sort of steam engine and steam power and electricity and train lines and so on, this is what funded it, was this wealth. And so I don't want to go down that road right now, but let's sort of move very quickly on to the next piece, which is I think more sort of philosophical, around the idea of where was it? Yeah, so I want to jump to the warlord thesis. I think we'll skip the middle piece here because there was some. So can we move straight to there? Because I think the middle section was sort of, I think, fairly obvious. But let's move to here, where we move into really the key part of the discussion, I think, now. So,
wars of the companions. How many people died in those wars? Do we have any numbers? For maximum, we can say.
Fair enough, man. And it's not like Christianity hasn't been rife with internecine conflict.
Yes. No, but the thing is,
but the fact is that it was almost immediately after Muhammad's death that this fracturing took place among the people that were closely allied with him, and it was a bloody fracturing. And it isn't obvious that it's been rectified.
How bloody was it? How bloody was it?
Well, how bloody does it have to be? You know, it doesn't take much.
Okay. Well, Jordan, let's be honest. Let's be fair.
Yeah.
But
okay.
Look, let's be fair, right? With the wars that took place 30 to 40 years, and it wasn't immediately after, because you said that in the video, the day he died. That's wrong. It didn't happen the day he died. It happened 30 to 40 years after. It happened 30 to 40 years after. And
well, how long? How many people? How many members of Muhammad's immediate family survived during that 30 years? My understanding was that most of his immediate family died in armed conflict.
Most of his immediate family died in his own lifetime.
Yes, well, I'm not speaking of them, but I'm speaking of what happened after he died.
These facts right, because
okay,
look, first fact, Muhammad, sallallahu we say sallallahu meaning peace and blessing be upon him. All of his children died in his life, okay, except for one. So most of the members of his immediate family and his wife died.
So let me stop there. We saw quite a lot of tension in that piece there. And we know that up to that point, we had like a brief seerah summary going on, which was absolutely fabulous, by the way, because I think what it did was it humanized the narrative. It really sort of brought it down to the fact that this is something that is real. It was a human being, and he said, "Let's retract this warlord thesis." That's what he basically said at that point, and I think that really riled the conversation to where we get to right now, which is it became quite emotional. So just for context, where does this warlord expansionist narrative come from, Brother Sharif?
Well, it comes from how Orientalist people who study Islam in the West have viewed Muslims and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. In fact, it even goes back to even Thomas Aquinas. I think he wrote some Theologica. I think it is. There's a very derogatory quote about the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in that, and it's always been the case. And I think to a certain extent that those in the West, Christian Europe at the time, they've always tried to demonize the Muslims and Islam because they've seen them as the other. They've seen them as an existential threat to their own sort of civilization. I'm talking about during Christian Europe in terms of during the Crusades and up to the 15th, 16th century. But this idea persists about these Muslims as being some sort of, led by some sort of despotic warlord, na'udhu billah, and therefore it's sort of within popular caricature. I think anybody who studies, or reads the biography of the life of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam would have a completely different picture. Even those that are written by non-Muslims, it's very, very clear. I think, Michael Hart, he wrote the 100 most influential people that have ever lived, at least recorded history. And he placed the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam famously at number 1. So that's not the, you know, you can't really think that's just somebody who's a warlord. Na'udhu billah. Yeah, that's somebody who's bringing something completely unique.
Exactly, because he then goes on and says, you know, basically there was quite a long discussion here, but really I think this really was very insightful for me, which was here. Here we go. Let's just pick this up here.
So, in fact, what I will actually argue today that the New Testament representation of Jesus Christ in his second coming is way more violent than Muhammad's conquests in the Medinan period.
Okay, well, look, like I said, I wasn't trying to make the case. I wasn't trying to make the case that what happened in Mecca or Medina was wrong. Like, so let me explain that a little bit. So Christian Europe fought a defensive war against the Nazis. It isn't obvious that that was wrong.
I don't think that was, I wouldn't say that's defensive.
Well, okay, fine. But I understand the concept of defensive war. And,
well, when America got involved in World War II, it was not under immediate threat by Germany, and they colonized it. And here's the thing: it overtook Western Germany. You see, and here's the thing: the term warlord that you use with the Prophet, you've never used with Harry Truman. You've never used with Roosevelt. You've never used with Winston Churchill, all of which conquered countries literally in wars. Because I feel like there is a bias there, and you've actually never used it with anybody else aside from the Prophet Muhammad in your public output. And I think that's unjustifiable. I think that you have biblical prophets like Moses, you have biblical prophets like Joshua, you have the Jesus in his second coming, all of which were warrior prophets, and you've only used the term warlord with the Prophet Muhammad. And I think that is unjustifiable. I think if what is it that what makes someone a warlord in then? If it's conquering lands, then Harry Truman is a
So actually, let me just finish this piece and then I'll get a question.
You know, and so on and so forth. In fact, the Prophet Muhammad.
Well, I guess that's a real tough question.
So, who is a warlord? And the question here, I think, was very well put, which is all of these world leaders that started wars historically, that is proven historically, have never been called warlords. So why is that? Why is it that these people are not being called warlords and yet Rasulullah was? What's going on in the psyche there? Because they're fighting for freedom, they're fighting for liberalism, they're fighting for truth as we believe it to be, so therefore it's right? It's justified.
Yeah, I'm glad actually Brother Hijab brought up Harry Truman, because this was the president of the US who actually said, thank God, after the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs were dropped, the nuclear bombs, the atomic bombs. So when he says thank God, whom is he thanking? He's God as a Christian. It's Jesus, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, so
I mean, the two most devastating explosions that ever took place on this planet happened under that watch. And we're still feeling the reverberations of that to this day still. And yet, they are not warlords.
Yeah. And there's also something else important to keep in mind. We know through authentic narrations that the Prophet ﷺ would say, and I'm just paraphrasing here, do not expect to meet the enemy, right? And that's the hadith continues, do not expect to meet the enemy, but if you do meet them, then know that paradise is under the shade of swords. And interestingly, this is what New Atheists, I mean, when I was reading the End of Faith, it just had that, you know, paradise is under the shade of swords, without actually the whole context. Islam doesn't encourage war. Islam doesn't encourage this idea that you should be eager to fight. We have narrations of the Prophet ﷺ, such as, again paraphrasing here, do not fight the Ethiopians unless they fight you, do not fight the Turks unless they fight you. So, you know, from our perspective, and you know, essentially what we're speaking about here is international relations, right?
Yes.
So from our perspective, we as Muslims cannot say that we believe in the realist theory, which is what these countries believed in. America, as in World War II, believed in. Essentially that national security is your primary concern. You can do preemptive strikes, and you know, all of these types of things. Here we have a case where the Prophet ﷺ is explicitly telling us not to attack these civilizations, and then there's civilizations which he encouraged the Muslims to fight, but those were already at war with Arabia, and they'd already actually encroached into Arabian territory and made vassals and stuff like this. So the thing is, the Prophet, peace be upon him, is not a figure you can ignore. Like Sharif said, Michael Hart's book about the 100 most influential men, but also, for example, there's a book by Russ Rogers called The Generalship of Muhammad. Now, Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. Now, basically, what Rogers says in the book is how the Prophet Prophet's warfare was actually psychological more than it was physical. And actually, he goes on to praise the Prophet in terms of his military victories and these types of things. Because the fact is, in that part of the world, you either had strength or you were dominated. It wasn't just like, okay, you're a tree hugging hippie, so's this one, and let's share water at the well. It was a very nasty world.
It's worth pointing out here, I think, and I think a lot of folks get sort of hung up on this idea of the word war, this 3-letter word. During the lifetime of Rasulullah and really up to the point of his death, when we talk about wars, these were essentially infighting between Arabian tribes, and it was predominantly restricted to essentially his extended family and the people that he knew, right? That was so we're talking about hundreds of people. When we talk about Truman and we talk about these world leaders, we're talking about deaths in hundreds of thousands. Millions. And so I think to use the word war for both of these scenarios is actually a misrepresentation. I mean, I can call the first one more of a skirmish. War is when you send, planes and metal and other things to destroy entire nations.
Well,
so I think sometimes I think that what I would call the scale of things matters.
Yeah, I mean, there is that, and it's very hard to actually define war and make the distinction between battles and wars. There's all sorts of, one thing which I read some time back was about if the casualties are over 1,000 in something like 6 months, then it's war as opposed to battles. Really.
Yeah. Who decides? Who decides? Exactly.
Yeah.
But at most, we're talking a few thousand of people or thousands of people at its sort of highest that were fighting within the Arabian Peninsula. Obviously after that, the phase, there were sort of other things that went on. But I think we need to understand context, and we need to understand scale as well of things.
Yeah,
I think. Did you want to come in here?
I was going to say. I think, Mohammed, the issue isn't really about war. I don't think even Jordan Peterson has a problem with war per se.
Oh, sorry, the war, because he was using the word warlord.
No,
the
that's
word
the point.
war is built into the term, right?
Yeah, but I think the word warlord is slightly more nuanced in terms of what it's trying to say about the leader. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Warlord is a derogatory term. That's the point. You use it, you apply it to criticize a particular
It's an insult.
person.
It's an insult.
It is.
Right?
Yeah, it is.
Exactly. It's an insult.
I just got a quick, definition. Just as so that people are aware of the connotations that it has. So a warlord is a person who exercises military, economic, and political control over a region in a country without a strong national government, largely because of coercive control over the armed forces. Yeah. So in essence, what it's trying to say is that you've got a small region, you've got a decentralized area, so you've got a place which doesn't have a centralized government, and then you have somebody who comes only because of physical arms of power, is able to coerce, people to follow his way. So,
right.
We think of warlords of like what's happened in, some of the civil wars that have taken place in Africa, some of the African countries, so, you think of that type of warlord. It's a derogatory term. It's basically saying that this person is no better than, or than just somebody who happened to come to military power and force and then coerce everybody based upon that physical power in a small region which is decentralized.
So, like the expansion of the Romans, for instance, right? Because that's what the Roman and the Byzantine
Mongols,
Empire did.
yeah, maybe,
and the
the
Mongols
beginning
as
of
well,
the Mongol empires, yeah.
Yes.
But with Islam, it's completely different. Obviously, firstly, the Prophet ﷺ, he spent 13 years in Mecca. He didn't raise arms. Then he established a society, a state within Medina. Then, obviously, he was under threat from the Meccans and the Quraysh who wanted to wipe out Medina. Then, he engaged in battles or wars, whatever you want to call it. He then went for a treaty, a peace treaty. He then went and he engaged in treaties with different neighboring tribes, brought people into Islam. Some of them, they were still antagonistic to his message, so there was fighting that took place. And then he established a strong centralized government based upon people's faith in him, not because he was seen as the most powerful person there. Yeah. Even later on, the Khulafa Rashidin, there's a famous story in which one of the, I think it was one of the leaders, I think it was a general, came to visit the Umar radiallahu anh in the mosque, in the Prophet Sallam's mosque in Medina. And he was asking, who's the Amir al-Mu'mineen? Who's this person who's defeated the Byzantines? Yeah. Who's, defeated the Persians? Who's, opened up Jerusalem, Bayt al-Maqdis, yeah, liberated that. Who is this person? Because he was expecting some massive entourage, this, big palace, these, Roman and Persian civilization had existed for thousands of years. Certainly the Persian civilization, Roman civilization, about 1,000 and so years. And he saw this, and he was pointed to a person who was lying, on a reed mat, sleeping in the masjid, and he was shocked. No guards around him. He actually said there's no guards around him, things like that. So this idea that the reason why the Prophet ﷺ was able to lead and create a civilization, or the Khulafa Rashidin after them, was because they were coercing people with power, is completely negated, because they didn't have to have armed guards, wherever they walked, like today's leaders. Rather, they were accepted by the people. Yeah, this is the nature of the type of civilization that they had created.
The very fact that you can walk and be amongst the general population and look no different to them, and there is no fear of attack, really, I think, demonstrates how much the people loved that leader. Right, because no leader today can do this. I mean, what do? I mean, today's leaders, they arrive in an entourage of vehicles that are protected, the bodyguards. They go stay in a hotel that is guarded, 24/7 round the clock. Everywhere they go, there's security detail around them, and when they leave, they go on private jets or private planes or specially chartered flights just in case. Right, this is the status of leaders today. And I think, what's worth, I think you eked it out very, very well there, Brother Sharif, which is the idea that a leader from what was at the time the superpower of the world, or, a leader, a representative of that leader, let's say, came and could not, just by eyesight, distinguish who the leader was, speaks volumes as to how that society was managed.
Yeah, indeed.
Okay, so this was the next surprising bit. So that was great. So we'll take a break. So peace treaties now. I think this took, Jordan quite by surprise, and I want to understand why did it take him by surprise?
Maintain the expansionist thesis. Well, here's what I'll tell you. Islam has a capability to be expansive, and it also has a capability of making peace treaties. And it does, and it should do whatever's in its best interest. Just like every country should do whatever's in its best interest. In the pre-modern world, we did not, I think this is highly anachronistic. In the pre-modern world, there was no such thing as the UN. It was a realist international relations framework whereby everybody was fighting everyone. The Roman Empire didn't care about it didn't care about you, quite frankly. It was expanding itself. The Persian Empire was expanding itself. And the Arabian Peninsula was in between both. And so it could have either been swallowed by those two other empires, or it could decide to, in fact, we will impose our governments on them before they impose it on us. And it decided the former rather than the latter. It decided to expand. And in fact, the Prophet, in his weakest of times, he predicted that that would happen. You know, there was one war in particular where they were starving, and it's called Khandaq, and he hit a rock and he said, Futihat Rum, the Roman Empire has been conquered. He hit a rock again. He said, Futihat Faris, that the Persian Empire has been conquered. And then he knocked the rock again. He said this in his weakest moment. He said that the Yemen has been conquered. I see that the expansion of the Islamic Empire is a proof for Islam. And you know, it's not just me. Even historians say this. Barnaby Rogerson, he said the fact that Islam spread to the Roman Empire and the Persian Empire is equivalent to is equivalent to Eskimos taking over Russia and America.
I want to just stop there. So this is actually a very powerful point, by the way.
Yeah.
A very, very powerful point. And I just want to contemporize it for today. So this is like today, somebody standing up on a platform and taking the lowest sort of GDP country on the OECD list and saying this country today that generates, you know, I actually don't have the list to hand, but saying this country within the next decade is going to be a superpower. I mean, this would be like sort of a prediction that could be made today. You make that prediction today, you'll be laughed out of the room. But this is exactly what happened here. And I think people sometimes forget just how strong and how overpowering the Persians and the Romans were. And for essentially a group of Bedouins to take them over, which is what it was something that even to this day historians, and I think Jordan Peterson actually started off early in the conversation saying, yes, but the expansion was so fast and so quick. He said this, I think, several times in the conversation. So, to ask the question, it still confuses historians to this day, does it not? As to how could a group of essentially ragtag individuals with no formal training in military strategic or weaponry of any kind take over two of the biggest powers of the time. I mean, this is still a mystery to this day, and I think there's volumes being written on it. Any comments on that?
I just wanted to share my screen and show the expansion of Islam.
Let me just stop this share here. Where is it? That one there. Do you want to share your screen? And while you're doing that, I think this idea that this, because the two nations were weak or something, is a complete misdirection, complete misnomer. They were in no way weak in that sense at the time that this happened.
Yeah. And it wasn't just Rome and Persia. I mean, there were other countries as well, like Egypt, Yemen, India, Constantinople. So
yes,
it's important to know that in that hadith, the Prophet ﷺ is actually in a trench. So in the war of Khandaq is actually the war of the trench, isn't it? And the Muslims in Medina were being attacked by the enemies. And that's where what Mohammed Hijab meant, like at the lowest, at the weakest position. So they are literally just defending their little army, the small army compared to the huge army of the non-believers, the Quraysh, I believe. Is that the expansion? Yeah.
So first of all, brother Sabur, this is a video from Business Insider. Just for those watching, who is Business Insider? I mean, is it a trustable source? Is it something that can be, relied upon?
You're muted, Sabur.
Yeah. So yeah, it is a pretty reliable source, and this is historically accurate. So you can see Christianity spreading, but look at what happens with Islam. Like if you look at the scale of the expansion compared to all other religions, right? The way Islam and speed. So the thing is, that's a really good animation. Actually, I go back and look at that sometimes, because the way that they put that together is according to chronology. It's according to which areas were conquered in years. And religions generally spread slowly, and you get these scattered type of
I believe it's
patches.
miraculous, if anything, that this
With Islam, what we get is this, and exactly like you said, Muhammad, that Peterson kept saying there's this explosion, and even in this video where it's going over other religions, when it comes to Islam, it says Islam spreads rapidly because it's literally like an explosion. Other religions are gradually over the centuries growing. With Islam, you literally have less than a century, and a huge part of the world is Muslim, and they've overtaken the the status quo of the Persians and the Romans being the dominating powers. And this is, like Hijab rightly pointed out, a miracle of Islam.
Yes.
And we should not be shy from that. We should actually be proud of it and use it as a form of dawah.
Good. So, Brother Sharif, did you want to mention anything there?
Yeah,
I want to move on to the next point, which is around nation states, which is the next sort of.
So I just wanted to mention, maybe try and make it as brief as possible.
No, of course. No, it's okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Firstly, I think there is this assumption that, oh, hold on, you Muslims, you believe you had this expansionist policy and it's, global warfare and all that type of thing. And I just find it really strange that, obviously that's very much a caricature of what Islam is about and what the Islamic civilization created and did in the past. But I find it ironic because, we live in the last, the 20th century. We have 20 years of America, Britain invading Afghanistan. We have this idea of liberal interventionism, which was coined by Tony Blair at the time. This idea that, liberal countries should be able to intervene and impose its values upon other nations if it sees it, quote unquote, going against human rights. We had the invasion of Iraq and the decimation of up to 1 million people in that country due to the invasion. Then we had bombings in Pakistan. We had bombings, drone attacks by America, Britain, in Pakistan, in Yemen, in Somalia. So this idea that the Muslims are somehow a unique problem that has to be wrestled with seems to completely forget what's occurred in the last 20 years. Yeah. And that to me, it's like the case that instead of recognizing some of the internal problems, what people tend to do is this whataboutism type of thing. Yeah. So rather than saying, actually, here's the real problem, we've had, 20 years in Afghanistan, and we've had 15 or so, 10 years, 15 years within Iraq, we've had the decimation of the colonial period as well, which only recently ended, but people talk about neo-colonialism. And suddenly we're talking about what happened 1400 years ago as though this is a problematic issue. Yeah. This is the issue at hand. The second thing I wanted to just really briefly touch upon is this idea, as the brothers have rightly mentioned, this idea of expansion. And I think the idea of expansion also destroys this notion of the concept of warlord within Islam, within the Prophet ﷺ, because we have examples of warlords who had rapid expansions like the Mongolian Empire. But Mongols, fractionated and then ultimately, became, part of the books of history within a very short period of time, within 100 years or so. Yeah, Mongols basically went back to being a tribal nomadic people. Yeah, and many of them actually became Muslim. And then obviously you have the Mughal Empire, with the Mughal Sultanate within India and other places as well. But the idea is that when Islam spread, those regions remained Muslim. Yeah, and it's more than that. Those people who weren't originally Arabs and weren't originally Muslim, yeah, they embraced the faith and they were the ones that spread it, like the Berbers who went into Andalusia, yeah. So the Berbers were the North Africans, they weren't Arabs, and so they went into North Africa. So Islam came as a civilization, and what it did is it created a new civilization that the people bought into, they believed in, yeah, and they embraced as their own. Yeah, as we can see on our panel, we're all from different parts of the world. Yeah, probably Indian subcontinent. I'm from India originally. Other brothers, Pakistan as well. Yeah. So the idea is that we embrace Islam as though it's our own. Yeah, but we think about it, actually, it's from Arabia 1400 years ago. So that is the nature of Islam. Now, a warlord can't do that because all the warlord has is coercive power. As soon as the coercive power goes, that's it. Or there's, infighting, or it becomes fractionated. All these things.
In recent history, we saw this during the fall of the Iron Curtain, the end of the Cold War, the end of what I would call, modern communism, where as soon as it fell, there was a mass movement of religion within those peoples that had been, forced into atheism, essentially.
Yeah.
And
the civilization collapsed. Yeah.
Exactly, it collapsed. And this is the thing. I think, it really sort of, I think, proves the point that you cannot change people's hearts by force. If the heart wants to believe something, and by this I mean the spiritual heart. I don't, we understand what that means as a religious discussion. What you want to believe is a choice, and no matter how much coercion takes place, that choice will not change if you genuinely believe it to be true. And this is I think the mistake a lot of superficial analysis, especially I think sociological studies, when they fall into this trap of only observing the superficial attributes of something, because they're unable to obviously look at what's inside people. What are they really thinking, feeling when they do something? And so what happened? It fell, and we saw mass conversion to religion, and we're seeing it to this day. Churches sprouting all over Russia, all over the old USSR as it used to be at the time, and obviously its sort of associated regions. Great point. Thank you for that. I just want to move on to the point about social contract trainingism that he made. Just before I go to that section, why was that very important to bring up in the context of this discussion? And I'll go to it. If you could sort of start off with why was social contract trainingism a very important point to make in this discussion, and sort of what was the sort of value of making that discussion there?
You mean the treaties? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah. So let me sort of listen to it, and let's go to it then. Let me just find it. Where was it? It was here. Because I think, so we have this discussion around treaties, and again, Jordan Peterson was quite surprised at this. He says, can you really have agreements? And he said, yes, we can. And then obviously we had the discussion around this point here, which is, let's have a look. Yeah, so it's sort of leading from here. There we go, somewhere around there.
In fact, divine, and you're managing to embody that in the sense that gives you the glow, the charismatic glow of embodied divinity, 2 steps removed, let's say, and people are willing to abide by your words as a consequence, well, more power to you. And that's a lot more efficient and effective than compulsory war, or armed conflict, or any of those things. And I mean, this is a constant problem. And I would also say that given our technological mastery now, we really can't afford this anymore. We have to solve this problem of defensive war, expansive war, evangelical religion, how to go about uniting us under some umbrella that isn't so vague that it means nothing. How to preserve our...
Go ahead.
So could you just pause that, because there's a lot of things being said. False equivocance being made between expansive war, defensive war, and evangelical religion. I understand that, there was an element even recently. What I mean by recently is the last, just 150 years, where evangelical Christianity was, part and parcel of the colonial project, right?
And the Crusades, of course.
And the Crusades as well. But in terms of the way that the British saw it was, in India, we have Hindus, we have Muslims, we have Sikhs, but the most listenable people are going to be these Christians. So they started evangelizing. They had these long-term evangelical projects. People like David Livingstone, who went to Malawi and went to these places, and all these people were linked to the colonial project. So that's fine. You can talk about that. However, to put Islam within that is dangerous. It's actually dangerous that we're putting war, defensive and offensive, and then we're putting the idea that religions are there to compete with each other, you know, and try and win over more followers. Because remember, the sort of the sort of thing that the liberal project, because he is still a part of that liberal spectrum. Just because he speaks out against one segment doesn't mean that he's still not on the spectrum. You know, they would love this pluralistic understanding that, you know, perennialism, you know, all rivers lead to the same sewer, right? We have to understand that, you know, he's looking at Islam's military expansion being linked to its evangelizing nature, and the fact that, according to him, he thinks that these two things are linked. But we wouldn't necessarily make those links. We would say, you know, the dawah or Islamic evangelism or whatever you want to call it, it can happen without military expansion.
Yeah, so just let me sort of come in here on I think Brother Sharif wants to make a point, but let me just make a quick point here. So I think let's draw a distinction between the expansionism of really sort of the 9th, 10th, 11th century and really sort of and sort of the subsequent ones, because all of those more or less were driven by what I would call an idea of greed. They were looking for wealth. You remember the whole sort of coercion that was made around go into these lands because there is treasure to be had, right? And you can take that. Now, if we look at sort of the expansion that took place, and you look at the situation, as Brother Sharif mentioned earlier, at the time when that visit happened with the Amir al-Mu'mineen, this was the leader of this entire empire at the time, right? So they had wealth beyond belief at the time. They were actually some of the richest. It was the richest empire in the world at the time, and yet they did not take advantage of any of that wealth. So what explains that? Because every other leader did, because they built big castles, they built, you know, they bought hoards of gold, jewelry, and crowns, and we have them to this day in museums.
Well, exactly, and we can even, I mean, you're talking obviously about the time after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, but we can look at the life of the Prophet ﷺ itself at the Battle of Hunain, in which, you know, the famous battle which you mentioned in the Quran, with the Sahaba were basically encircled, and the Prophet ﷺ charged ahead and rallied the Sahaba, and they won. They won all this ghanima, and this ghanima in today's money would be literally millions. It would be huge amount of money, because remember, livestock was worth a lot. Livestock's worth a lot today. And what basically happened, the elite vanguard of the Prophet ﷺ, the Ansar, were given nothing. And the people who were mushriks, who lived locally, they came up to him, and they were even, you know, grabbing him and give me, you know, this type of thing. And he gave to people who were mushriks, who didn't even partake in the battle. And the norm at the time was that the amount of participation in the battle, it was equivalent to the amount of ghanima that you were going to be given, the amount of war booty you were going to be given. So these people were given money. Essentially, they were given livestock, even though they didn't join the battle, but they were around this area. And the psychology behind this was that for them to warm up to Islam. And usually when you come to these despotic warlords, they enrich their inner circle and
themselves
impoverish even people who participate in the battle, and let alone the people who did not participate. So it's the exact inverse. And obviously the gift that the Ansar got was that the Prophet ﷺ is buried with them today. That was his gift, right? I mean, that's his legacy.
Just as an aside, I mean, we're in the UK, and we know in the UK they have this idea of the lord and ladies, the lords of the manor, and so on. And what were these lords doing? They were taxing the poor in their hamlet or their city. And how were they taxing them? Even if they could not afford it, they still had to take their share. So whatever money they had, and so this, I think this historical precedent was set during those times, and yet we don't see that anywhere, at least, you know, during that history. Brother Sharif, did you want to come in here on any comment?
I think it's Mashallah Sabboor has mentioned the key points. I think, again, like I said, I think Jordan Peterson has this sort of really weird sort of notion about Islam as being sort of this, warrior, Mongols coming out, of this barbaric state going around forcing people to convert to Islam, and that's how it expanded. And I think you mentioned it as well as Mohammed and Hashim as well, which is that you can't force people to become Muslim, just like communist Russia. They literally forced people to leave religion as soon as communism died. And a lot of the regions that communists controlled were Muslim regions, like Uzbekistan, where Imam Bukhari was buried. And they they hid the body of Imam Bukhari where he was buried, because they would dig up the grave and they would basically desecrate, the bodies of the ulama and the scholars. And so they hid it in a warehouse. And as soon as it opened up, people flooded out. And this was 70, 80 years under communism. So it's not like a short period of time. And they flooded out. And many of them, it was noted or said, couldn't pray Salah. They didn't know how to pray Salah, but they knew it was Friday and they knew it was Jummah and they knew they had to go to the mosque. Yeah. So they would just go. Yeah. And then over a period of time, obviously, alhamdulillah, they learned their deen. So this idea that you can just force people to become, Muslim, and then that's how Islam spread, it's just crazy. And this idea, again, that Islam is not this civilization that, yes, will have warfare, but also has peace. It also has trade. It also engages with other nations. It has these rules regards to it. Maybe that's surprising for Jordan Peterson, but for many Muslims, we know about this because it's from the seerah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Treaty of Hudaybiyah is an example. Other treaties that took place. The opening of Jerusalem was through a treaty. It wasn't through warfare. The patriarchs of Jerusalem wanted to live under Umar radiallahu anhu and the caliphate, as opposed to the Byzantine rules, which they perceived as oppressive because they had a particular version of Christianity that was perceived as oppressive, and that there were high taxation, and they knew Muslims would provide better quality of life. So, it's just like I said, the history of Islam. If people read it and understand it, yes, there are aspects, particularly in the later period, where there are problems and there are things where they divert from Islam and there are oppressions. But in the early period of Islam, and certainly if we take it as a global picture, we see a very successful civilization that's able to mold people.
Alhamdulillah. Okay, so let's move on to this. So this is now a very important point that's made here.
I can't see any better way than each of us trying to be shining exemplars of our tradition, and then letting that goodness shine forth in a way that people, it may be the case that we'll find that the better we are, the more we're like each other. I mean, wouldn't that be a kind of union under something approximating God?
So I've got to commend, I think, Peterson here. I mean, despite the misanalogies and the equivocation of whatever, he is actually expressing a sentiment of, let's understand each other. Let's try and get to some common ground and move forward. And while it may have been not said very well, I think the sentiment is clear and he's reaching out. And I think he needs to be commended for that. And I think Brother Hijab, I think he recognized that, because the next thing that he says is, yeah, I think we can. And then I think we bring up the point of the nation states, which is very important, because
all good men could see in each other a reflection of something that was the highest, and that should be compelling in and of itself.
Absolutely. But I think in terms of the jurisprudence, in terms of what Islam is capable of, people in the West must realize that Islam is fully capable of peace. This is what must be realized. How do we know that? It's not despite the Quran and the Sunnah or the sayings of the Prophet and the actions, but it's because of them. If you look at the Quran and you look at, for example, chapter 4 verse 90, or if you look at, for example, chapter 1 verse 90, chapter 2 verse 190, you'll see that the Islamic commandments are clearly sometimes about defensiveness, but sometimes also clearly about creating peace treaties. And this Treaty of Hudaybiyah is a bedrock example. So long as there's peace treaties, there is peace. And so in terms of Muslim countries, they can perpetually create peace treaties with other people. Muslim people, even more so, because we believe we're fully under contract. And therefore...
So you're willing to abide by a contract?
Okay, why did he have to say you're willing? Why is that a surprise? You're willing to abide by?
Ju-
I mean,
so just on
it
that
sounds
point,
such a sort of like a
uh,
non,
okay,
Yeah,
non
it was a bit
statement.
underhanded. Yeah.
yeah, no, there's actually a background to this.
Oh,
Okay,
is
There's
it?
go.
actually
Tell me. Yeah, go ahead.
so what it is Hijab mentioned previously, or I think he may mention it later, that the point at which Islam and, if you like, Western secular liberal um, um, ideas or civilizations can have something in similar is in terms of contracts, in terms of consent. Basically the social contract. Because remember, look, just a bit of just to recap what was being said earlier about realism and stuff. Basically, when we were in a state of nature, supposedly, and you had all against all, you had to come together and have this social contract, and that social contract was binding, and that's why people basically set up institutions and set up the societies that they did. So contracts and being true to your word, which is a huge thing, is an absolutely huge thing in the Western civilization. In fact, even in his 12 rules for life, I think basically one of his things about speaking precisely and truthfully, and living by your word and that type of thing. So because he has a misunderstanding of Islam being a religion which was militarily expansive and a warlord with a warlord type of mentality, warlords would not respect contracts. Warlords would not respect peace treaties. Warlords would not respect these type of things because they would get in the way of their self-interests. So it sounds condescending, but it's not, if you look at the perspective from which he's coming from, because it's the same thing. If Hijab mentioned to him, Hassan ibn Haytham, and science goes back before, Galileo, he'd have the same reaction, and we'd think that's condescending, but it's not. It's simply his misunderstanding. Because remember, from
his worldview, I think he's that's what he's expressing, isn't it?
Yeah, because remember, he, because he sees the Western civilization as the pinnacle, he's assuming there's certain things that they have which are unique to them. But here he's finding out that actually, Islam has those things as well. So that's why the surprise, right? And it's not a. I don't think.
Also, the title. If you look at the title of his podcast, it says Islam and the Possibilities of Peace. See what I mean? So it's, I don't know whether that has
again, there's a background to that. And the background to that is he's been speaking to people like Douglas Murray, who have, in his book, The Strange Death of Europe and elsewhere, where he basically speaks about Muslims being alien. He's had conversations with Sam Harris, and that other guy, whoever he is, writing about Islam intolerance. So again, how Islam is incompatible with the West, how Islam is warlike, how Islam is intrinsically going to be like a bull in a china shop in the West, and all of these myths. Yeah. So that's why Islam and the Possibilities of Peace is in the context of all of the previous people that he's been speaking to, like Ayaan Hirsi, who again speaks about how things should be made difficult for Muslims, right? And that Muslims cannot basically live in the West and cannot actually be peaceful. So if you look at all of his previous guests, they're basically saying Islam, no peace, warfare, instability, sexual attacks on people, like what Ayaan Hirsi keeps claiming. And here, the title I thought was very positive. It's like a way of telling the other side there's another side to this, and that is that there is a possibility of peace.
Yeah, I think
I'm maybe a little bit more. I'm a bit more skeptical of Jordan Peterson's.
Okay.
Mashallah, Sabboor's giving him a good husna done.
Or
at least given the context,
yeah,
which is fair enough. He's got a particular mindset, and he's getting information from one angle, and therefore he's perceived it in a particular way. But I think, again, this idea that, the West upholds the idea of treaties and make it, the pinnacle. And yet at the same time, you know, Canada and America have been involved in rendering Muslim citizens, you know, who are supposedly Al-Qaeda or ISIS. Like there's one person called Maher Arar from Canada, who is a Canadian Syrian, who was rendered to Syria by the CIA, and he was tortured by the Syrian intelligence. And then later, he was found to be completely innocent. And then he went back to Canada, and then he lodged he lodged a court case against the Canadian government and also the American government. Similarly, we have Guantanamo Bay. Guantanamo Bay is the whole idea is to completely usurp the international agreements on how to treat prisoners of war, because this was a completely, you know, outside of international law. It's not recognized by America. It's not recognized by anybody else. So therefore, they're able to take these people and call them enemy combatants. Yeah. So there's many examples. Look, even America was founded upon the betrayal of the Native Americans. Numerous treaties that they made with the Native Americans, they broke. Yeah. So, you know, it comes across as though it's this moralizing, this idea. And again, you know, Jordan Peterson comes from a particular background. He may not realize it, but it does come across as a Muslim that it's this moralizing, this idea that Western civilization is superior, and that the problem is with these Muslims in Islam and people who are of a different Western persuasion or from a different geographical location or Protestant religious background different to that. And there's a really interesting book by a Christian Arab. His name is Joseph Massad. And he wrote Islam in Liberalism. And he talks about this. He talks about the colonial mentality that it had towards the Muslim world, that it saw themselves as democratic, civilized, you know, and, you know, peaceful people, whereas it saw the non-Europeans, particularly the Muslims, as despotic. And they started to cite things like the Prophet ﷺ was a warlord, Na'udhu Billah was a despot, and therefore that they were, in essence, either in need of being subdued because they are a threat to civilization, or to be educated like they are children because they need to be educated like quote-unquote liberal secular Western values and civilization. So this, and both of these strands of thought meant that it justified colonization. It justified it because it saw the Muslims as a threat. And in the same way, this idea that, oh, Muslims can abide by, you know, a contract of security living in the West is something like, wow, really? You know, that you do that? You mean you abide by the law? It's like, well, yeah, okay, yeah, just like everybody else.
Yeah, exactly. And okay, so great point, I think there. And you know, so because this conversation then went on, and he brought out the idea of are the Islamic nations unsuccessful because of Islam, or is it you know failing for some other reason? And I just want to sort of dwell on that point just momentarily. Just let me get to where are we? I think it's around here somewhere. We're getting to the end of the discussion now, of course. So we're beginning to see signs of things wrapping up and concluding statements that are beginning to be made now. But there is this very important statement that's made around here.
President and a Sunni prime minister and a Shiite, I don't know what it is, first minister or something. I mean, they have systems that try and mitigate these issues, but it's a mess because you're putting people that have different visions of how to run a country together, and there's similar demographics. It's like 30%, 40%, 20%, and so that creates more wars. But they put them together almost on, I would argue, on purpose, to be honest. It's divide and conquer.
If you look at countries like Denmark and Sweden and Norway, which are very peaceful and very prosperous, they're also very homogenous. And they're relatively small. So the problem of governance over diversity is much reduced in countries like that. It's simpler for them to be at peace because the culture is relatively homogenous. And so I take your point. It's not easy to bring a true diversity into something approximating a unity, especially when that unity has been, in some sense, arbitrarily imposed, and also rapidly and arbitrarily imposed. So that's a reasonable point.
Yeah. Right. I think what it is, and I've seen this in your reading list, it's like when you follow kind of Bernard Lewis's or Samuel Huntington's kind of Clash of Civilization narratives, sometimes you miss the nuances, and these are the nuances.
Yeah, well, that's for sure.
There are myriad contributory factors to why, and it's I still don't see how Islamic countries, there's like almost 50 Muslim majority countries, are in general, like you made a point about economic potential one time. You said that.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that because, well, that's another thing that's quite a mystery, is that comparatively speaking, per capita, the Muslim countries are not that productive economically.
So I just want to stop there. Economists use this idea of per capita as a measure of success for a country. Comments? Is that a valid measure? Is it not? I mean, it seems arbitrary.
So I'll give you an example of this, right? We as Muslims, we have a non-capitalistic understanding of success. So for us, we would be looking at, of course, security. We'd be looking at, economic development and these types of things. But we'd also actually be looking at the level of zina. We'd be looking at family stability. We'd be looking at whether orphans and widows are actually taken care of. So, to have this very crude way of looking at the world in terms of how it's doing per capita, and we know a lot of the countries which are doing really well have a brutal colonial past, right? So we also need to keep that in mind. And as Sharif rightly was pointing out earlier, even today that neo-colonial project continues. Democracy happens to be very urgently needed in places which happen to be approximate to resources. So we have to take these things with a ton of salt when we're being asked about these sort of behind.
For me, and I'll let Brother Sharif come in here, but for me, I think the key is that there is a big presumption being made here that per capita success is the only measure of success, right? So there's no discussion here. This is the measure of success. Then the question becomes, so why are you not meeting this metric, right? And I think recent studies and lots of research over the last sort of few decades have demonstrated that wealth in terms of turnover in GDP is not a measure of happiness, let me call it, right, for nations. And Brother Sharif, you wanted to come in here.
Mohammed, you made a really good point, which is that just looking at economic growth, and even this idea of economic growth per capita, meaning per head of person, is sort of it misunderstands, because it's taking the GDP, the gross domestic product, or the gross national product, GNP, of the whole nation, and then dividing it according to the citizens. So it actually could be the case that there's a small number of group of individuals that are making absolutely crazy amounts of money, but on average, everybody's making a certain amount. That's the first thing. The second thing is and I think Sabor made the point, which is that Jordan Peterson seems to have completely forgotten about the 150 to 200 year history of colonialism that the Muslim world has suffered, and that the West was able to feed off regardless of this. So for example, Samuel Huntington, who was mentioned by Mohammed Hijab, he said this quote. This is his quote. He goes, "The West won the world not by the superiority of its ideas or values or religion, but rather by its superiority of applying organized violence. Westerners often forget this fact. Non-Westerners never do." Yeah. So this idea that, yes, it's because of superiority of values and religion. This is why we're so civilized and these other people are not. They're barbaric. That's why they're so backward. No, it wasn't like that. It was because of the ability for the West to organize violence. Yeah. And there's another professor now who really explains this further point about why the Muslim world today maybe not where it should be in terms of development, not just economically, but politically, socially, other factors as well. His name is Professor David Fromkin. He's an expert on economic history at the University of Chicago, and this is what he said. He said, "Massive amounts of wealth of the old Ottoman Empire were now claimed by the victors," meaning the Europeans. "But one must remember that the Islamic Empire had tried for centuries to conquer Christian Europe, and the power brokers deciding the fate of those defeated people, meaning the Muslims, would naturally determine that these countries, either West, the Muslim world, sorry, should never be able to organize and threaten Western interest again. With centuries of mercantilist experience, Britain and France created small, unstable states whose rulers needed their support, i.e., France and Britain's support, to stay in power. The development and trade of these states, i.e., these small, unstable states within the Muslim world, were controlled, and they were not meant never again to threaten, to be a threat to the West. These external powers then made contracts with their puppets to buy Arab resources cheaply, making the feudal elite enormously wealthy while leaving most citizens in poverty. This is what Professor David Fromkin's saying. He's saying that
in which book is it an article or a book that he wrote?
It's a book. I'll send you the quote, inshallah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I'll send you the
So this is
Yeah.
an academic writing in a peer-reviewed text, and he's stating this publicly. So there's no dispute here that it's some personal opinion in some deep,
he's
dark, unknown.
he's a professor of economic history, so
Right.
he's not just some person who's giving his own
Good.
particular opinion.
Okay.
And so the point that he's trying to say is that look, you had colonization of the Ottomani Khilafah, you had the Muslim world generally as well, and then what and we know the Sykes-Picot Agreement in 1916, where they made a secret agreement to divide different states under the French influence and the British influence during World War I. Yeah, and they said, okay, Syria, Lebanon can go to the French, Jordan, Iraq can go to the British, etc. Yeah, and then what they did was that they installed a particular feudal elite, and we know that this still exists today. It's why we talk about neo-colonialism. Like, for example, Egypt. The Egyptian military still gets billions of pounds worth of military aid every year from the American government. How is it that the why would the American government be giving so much money, to the Egyptian military generals? It's because it's a way of controlling the country, isn't it? It's a way of controlling the leadership. Yeah. Similarly, even in Pakistan, we had a situation, particularly during time of Musharraf, where there was direct military aid that was given not to the civilian government, but actually bypassing civilian government and going straight to the generals. Yeah. Because it's a way of being able to control. And so this influence still exists. Yeah. And it's not within, the interest of multinational corporations that are based in the West and Western capitalist states to allow the Muslim world to utilize its resources for the benefit of those people. Rather, it is easier to manipulate, to control these resources, utilize these resources for their own self-interest, even if it's at the detriment of that population. So why is there low GDP per capita? Yeah, well, because of not just the fallout of colonialism, but the continued interference within the Muslim world. That's what Jordan Peterson needs to understand. That's what a lot of people in the West, particularly in academia, need to start to appreciate. It's not because of Islam or anything like that.
Absolutely. Yeah. And what I would add there, Brother Sharif, I mean, we actually did a stream a little while ago on feminism and how, I mean, there's a big history around this, but it's really sort of interesting to understand that post Second World War, there was a deliberate strategy to take advantage of the other half of the workforce. The female workforce that wasn't contributing to GDP because that was seen as the success metric. And so consequently, the rise of feminism, liberalism, the one parent family, state benefits to support that kind of model, to allow working mothers to basically forsake their motherhood in pursuit of GDP. And we're now realizing under the current environment that we live in, the exact effects of that. And we're seeing, actually a generation of women that are ruining the day that they decided to do this, including some of the early feminists who are now saying, I wish I'd actually, been a mother and so on and so forth. And I think just to add, the final point I want to add there is Islamic nations in general, mothers are mothers and they stay at home, which means if you take a GDP measure and you share it amongst the populace, you will, just by basic math, arrive at a lower number. right? Because half, on average, a large proportion of the workforce, of the female workforce, is not in the workplace, and so they're technically, as far as the Western measure is concerned, they're not contributing. But this is, as Brother Sabur was saying, but our measure of success is: do we have a cohesive family unit? Do we have next to zero zina, or what we would call out of wedlock relationships? How low are they? Abortions, non-existent pretty much, and so on and so forth. To us, having those metrics at close to zero is seen as more successful than just having a financial metric like GDP or GNP.
And you make some really good points, but just
yeah.
so I was just going to say, just to add.
Yeah,
So
Go
Jordan Peterson's response to Mohammed Hijab was talking about Scandinavian countries, but again, Scandinavian countries never had the same history that the Muslim world have, and they don't
Good
have the
point.
same level of interference. So it's not equivalent. Yeah. Sorry,
It's not
Hashim, I
comparative.
interrupted.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah,
Go, Hashim.
I was just going to say that these Scandinavian countries, they have actually become atheists today. They are not Christians. So if he's coming from a Christian background saying that they are successful, they actually left Christianity for atheism. So in that case, would that mean, by his logic, that if you leave religion, you become richer? And then there are other countries, which are poor, which have very low GDP, who are neither Muslim nor Christian. They might be atheists, they might be some other religion. Yes, take the case of India, for example. The GDP is not that high. Take the case of other countries. So it's not really a measure of success or not, because there are many successful people perhaps in these countries which do have lower GDPs.
Yeah.
So it's I don't know, it's a false measure.
No, I fully agree.
Just as
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, just as a further point as well, Scandinavian countries also have the highest use of antidepressants, particularly Denmark. Denmark is the most use of antidepressants in the whole of Europe. Yeah.
Yeah.
So this idea that these are models to follow, there are a lot of other problems with regards to these countries.
You got to remember
the whole point about GDP.
What I would add there
measure.
as well. Yeah, what I would add as well is the Scandinavian countries are quite regularly touted as sort of the epitome of peaceful nations, but you got to remember that why do they not tout the Latin American countries that were invaded by the Catholic Christians? Why do they not tout the Asian countries, like Java that was taken over by the Dutch, and the Indonesian colonies there? Why do they not tout those? They tout the countries in the north where there was very little to no immigration ever, very little to no interference or non-governmental interference anyway from other nation states, and other than the so-called Viking history that they had, which wars did they go into, other than supporting maybe some of the European conflicts that happened during World War I and World War II? They were supporting actors. They were never main propagators of any of those conflicts. So I think on many levels, this comparison, which actually is used in almost every conversation I go into, it's actually it's a mistaken comparison from the get-go because the premise is wrong.
Yeah, let's move on.
Yeah, let's move on. Okay, so we're getting to the close of the discussion now, so I want to move quickly to.
Did we cover the story of the Prophet ﷺ and his reaction to Habashi, who killed his uncle? The mercy of the Prophet ﷺ. I think that's quite an important point, which
we can cover. Do you want to rewind to that? Well, we can go rewind to that.
Let's finish this. Maybe we can take that at the end.
Okay, all right. Let's
just keep the flow.
Because we're on a bit of so let's remember that point.
Yeah.
Because I think what I want to get to is where he sort of mentions that the historical framing does matter, and he makes a point. I think just the sort of actually, let's listen to it first of all, and then we'll where is it? It's at yeah, there we go. I think it's over here somewhere. Towards the end. There we go. I think it's around here.
to be wrong because it means you have to improve. You have to look at your errors. I'm asking you personally, like when you're dealing with your wife, when you're dealing with your kids, you know, how do you know when, how is it that you can protect yourself against being overweening?
So this is an interesting point. So we had a very sort of what I would call a high level political, religious, you know, and then it becomes very, very personal all of a sudden. What do you think was going on there? Why did he ask this very personal question of how do you personally deal with this? Any comments there?
So, Borbai, I think you probably might be able to.
Well, the way you deal with a situation. Oh, I'll give you an example of something. I was talking to one of the earlier on with one of the brothers today, and he has this habit where basically he doesn't have jealousy if someone else has something else, right? So we have this as human beings. You know, if somebody is richer than us or whatever, and human beings have this type of jealousy. And he said that when he was little, his father, you know, if he wanted something because his sibling had it, he would say to him, no, that's not a reason why you should have something just because someone else has it. So sometimes those things that happen inside the house, they actually influence your entire philosophy. You know, we've had many thinkers in the past who have, you know, Freud and others who, you know, experiences that they've had just impact everything. So that's what I remember. He is a psychologist, right? So he's not going to ask any superfluous question, and I think that's the.
Well, this is why I'm asking. Well, I mean, why? Because he's clearly doing a bit of psychoanalysis here. I mean, he can't get away from it because he is.
That's the intention. What he wants to do is he wants to find out, okay, how do you deal with this situation? And so that's how he must look at international relations.
Right? Exactly. Yeah. I mean, well,
what does he mean? Sorry, what does he mean by being overweening to your children? I didn't quite understand his question. I don't know if the brothers here can.
Yeah.
Remember, he's against totalitarianism. He's against the state. And remember, look at his tweets about the vaccines, right? Look at his stances. I mean, I'm not taking a stance on his stance. I'm just saying he's very much like, you know, freedom of speech, freedom of action. Government's not there to tell you about pronouns. It's not there to tell you about vaccines. So that's what he means by, you know, this overweening thing. I mean,
yes. So actually, this brings it. So the reason I remember I caught this was because this, I think, goes back to the very early point that Mohammed Hijab made, which is Islam means submission. And what he's saying is, if you're submitting, then isn't that totalitarian? I think that's the logic that's being used here.
That's interesting.
And right, I mean, my interpretation. So, you know, obviously I can be wrong, but I think he really wants to take it to the point of, well, where is your freedom then? Where is your individual liberty, your individual freedom, your freedom? And we say yes, we have. I mean, I'll let you gentlemen comment. So, Sharif, do you want to come in on that? That's my thinking.
Yeah, I think So obviously, it is complete submission, but totalitarianism is something different. It's a political concept of the state.
Right.
It's about the state controlling every aspect of your life. And we know that's not the case with regards to Islam, that it allows the state to control every aspect of your life. You know, there are rules related to the Ahl al-Dhimma, the non-Muslims, how they're able to have their own courts, they're able to eat their own foods, regards to their own, you know, related to their religious practices. We also have examples during time of Umar radiallahu anh, where he overheard something in a person's house and he jumped over the wall and he caught this person, you know, dancing, drinking, and was with women. And he said, I'm going to, you know, bring you to court. Umar radiallahu anh was leader at the time. And then the man turned around and said, well, hold on, I've made a mistake, but you're making 3 mistakes. And then he goes through it. He said, you know, you entered without permission, you spied upon me, and then you didn't come by the front entrance, rather you jumped over the wall. And Umar radiallahu anh recognized that it's not allowed. If a person's committing sin in the privacy of his own home, you know, the idea is that, well, it only affects him and it's between him and Allah. Yes, if he does it in open, in the public, then the state would intervene. So this idea that the state is totalitizing, Yeah, completely involved. And again, you know, giving examples within the West, we see this in the West. This concern he has exists within the West. Like, for example, all communication, there was a Communication Act that was passed in the UK a few years ago, which says all communications now have to go via GCHQ. So GCHQ, which is basically a listening, governmental listening device that are able to listen to all conversations that's taking place. All communication has to go via them. Yeah. So they literally are able to know what's being said if they want to bring it up, and ISPs have to store a certain number of a certain amount of time what's happening in people's internet searches and things like that. So yeah, so this is, but in Islam that would be prohibited for the state to do that. Yeah. So it's, in the context as a Muslim, I need to be aware that what I do on the internet is Islamic, but for the state, they can't turn around and start spying upon my ISP addresses, yeah, things like that, which is what we see in current today's age.
So, I mean, we know that there was a case actually in Dubai recently where a husband, hopefully I get the facts right, I don't want to, but I think he took his wife to court and won the case because she spied on his phone, because she suspected him of you know, having some kind of affair or something, and the court basically said Islamically you're not allowed to do this, right? You're not allowed to pry into somebody's private affairs, right? And in fact, it's actually a crime in you know, under sort of UAE law. Now, where does that come from? It comes from Islam. Now, you know, their implementation may be, I mean, I don't know, I'm not a lawyer, but what I'm saying is this idea that, and we know from the time of the Prophet as well, that if somebody's doing something in their own house, you can't go pry on them to discover what they're doing and then claim that it's a crime, right? You're not allowed to do this. So this is something that is, you know, way back, you know, deep in our own theological understanding as well. Brother Hashim, did you want to say anything there?
No, let's move on, inshallah.
Okay, so we're getting to closing statements. So
yeah,
really, I just want to close off this last bit, and then we'll go back to one of the other points, where basically he makes the point around basically this idea of pragmatism and traditionalism. I mean, that's really what it is. So let's sort of finish this last few minutes, and then we'll.
Now, this is a good question. You're going to get me in trouble with this kind of thing right now, you know, Peterson. This is a good question. What it is
smiling,
that,
by the
I've
way,
been married for like 9 years now.
A bit different to when it started.
And I've had to learn that the hard way. You know, I've had to learn that the hard way, that I protect myself by realizing or know my own vulnerability, my own fallibility, my own weakness, the fact that I don't get everything right. The fact that there's another perspective, that there's something outside of myself which is greater than me.
Yeah, well, that's okay. So that's something like, you know, because a serious discussion can be had about the relationship between humility and love, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think a certain degree of humility is a precondition for love, because otherwise you can't take the perspective of the other person. Like, how can you, if you don't think you're wrong? And for me, and it's certainly been the case, this was useful in my clinical practice and certainly in my marriage, is I'm trying to be as attentive as I can to when I'm wrong. And that seems to be a reasonable move
that comes
forward,
out, and I think that's really good. That's a good part of your person. I think that's why a lot of people actually love your work and love you as a person, because you come across as extremely authentic and sincere. That we don't find that kind of thing in kind of a lot
it's
of
not like
discourse.
it's not like it's obvious to me that the Christians have it right and the Jews and the Muslims have it wrong. And so that's certainly not the case at an individual level. It's way more complicated than that, way more. And so we're just not going to go for answers. If we go for answers like that, we're going to be at each other's throats. And how about we aren't? How about we're not? How about we make peace? Hey, and so you and I, we had a peaceful conversation, so good for us, and hooray. And hopefully we'll have some more. And I would very much like to see you in Cambridge or Oxford, and you can listen to my arguments in a more detailed.
Okay, we don't need to go. So I think it finished on a good note. And I think, you know, we got to a point where he was invited to one of his lectures moving forward. So in summary, And we'll go back to the point that Brother Hashim made. Actually, do you want to do that now, Brother Hashim, or do you want to maybe?
Yeah, let's do it now before we close.
Yeah.
I think. Yeah.
So let me just sort of find where it was.
Because I think that was one of the key responses to the warlord comment of his, to show the human side of the Prophet ﷺ, you know, how he dealt with his staunchest enemies, even his own family who were killed and mutilated by this his former enemy, you know, al-Habashi. Even that person was forgiven by him. And this is something.
Yes, here we go. Yeah, it's actually in there we go, 47:26. It's actually over here. We skipped over it actually when we were moving on to one of the other points. So let's sort of discuss it here. There we go.
Immediate family died in armed conflict.
Most of his immediate family died in his own lifetime.
Yes, well, I'm not speaking of them, but I'm speaking of what happened after he died.
These facts right, because
okay,
look, first fact, Muhammad sallallahu, we say sallallahu meaning peace and blessing be upon him. All of his children died in his life, okay, except for one. So most of the members of his immediate family, and his wife died, Khadija died, his uncle Abu Talib died, his other uncle Hamza died. They all died within his lifetime, either due to illness or due to some other cause, war, for example. Like one of the defensive wars, Hamza died. And by the way, Muhammad forgave his killer, and that's something which goes against the warlord thesis, because when he then conquered Mecca, it was actually no fighting. I'm not sure if you know this. It's called Fath Mecca. When he went into and conquered Mecca, he didn't fight anybody. It was no fighting. There were a few people that were exempted, but he actually quoted what Joseph quoted to his brothers in the Quran, which is "La tathriba alaykum al-yawm," that no blame is on you today. And this, by the way, is a bedrock example of forgiveness in Islam, because these were people that were persecuting him for 13 years. These are people that killed his uncle. Like I said, there's one person called Wahshi who literally killed his uncle and mutilated his body. And he said to Wahshi, "I forgive you, but I can't see your face because of how he said, ممكن تغيب عني وجهك وجهك عني." He said, "Can you keep your face away from me, because I can't bring my face, but I do forgive you," he said. So he forgave people that killed his own family members. And this was after he himself attempted a treaty with the pagans called Hudaybiyah. And so they broke the treaty, and that's what initiated the conquest of Mecca, which was not a conquest, that was fighting. Now, if you compare this, because I think the comparison, if there's any comparison that can be or should be made, it's Jesus' second coming with Muhammad in the Medinan period, not in the Meccan period. In the Meccan period, both were being persecuted, Jesus in his life and Muhammad in the Meccan period. But Jesus, when he comes back, he will then get authority, and he will be ruling with the iron scepter, according to the Bible. He will be crushing his enemies, as it says in Corinthians, under his foot, humbling his enemies under his foot, and killing and violent stuff. So, in fact, I will actually argue today that the New Testament representation of Jesus Christ in his second coming is way more violent than Muhammad's conquests in the Medinan period.
Okay, well, look, like I said, I wasn't trying to make the case. I wasn't.
So this is quite an important message from Brother Muhammad, mashallah, with regards to this this point here, which normally the Christians or even the non-Muslims make against the Prophet ﷺ, that he's always been fighting wars, killing XYZ. So there are many incidences such as this where the Prophet ﷺ, you know, in the Quran is called Rahmatul Alameen for a reason. But no one brings up that point. No one brings up the point that the Prophet ﷺ, when he shows mercy to his staunchest enemies, to the people who killed his own family members, you know, it's quite a important and significant point here. And the other thing is, he contrasted the life of Jesus in his second coming with that of the Medinan period. Now, this is another, allegation that the Christians and the non-Muslims makes make against the Prophet ﷺ, that when he was in the Meccan period, when he was weak, he did not fight wars. But when he was strong and he had an army during the Medinan period, he started waging wars. However, that's not true, because as Hijab, I think you pointed out during the course of the interview, that there were many wars that did take place during the Meccan period, and many of them were defensive, and the same during the Medinan period. But the key point here was that when the Prophet ﷺ was strongest was actually in the Medinan period, which is true. But what did he do when he conquered Mecca? So this conquest was basically, it comes as a reason of breaking the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. And when he entered with an army of 10,000, his companions, he could have taken vengeance against all those people who persecuted him, his family, his companions. They tortured and killed many of his companions, driven them to hunger and all sorts of boycott against them, to the extent that he was forced to leave Mecca and migrate to Medina with some of his companions. So when he entered victorious in Mecca, yes, and this was like literally no bloodshed, because they overpowered them just by numbers and by their might as well. He could have taken vengeance and he could have killed all those people who persecuted him and oppressed him and his companions and his family and so on. But he didn't. He forgave them. And
Yes.
this is the beauty of the difference between what they allege against the Prophet ﷺ, that during the Medinan period, he was actually mighty and he would fight war, but during the Meccan period, he was like weak and he wouldn't fight any wars. But even when he was strongest, he still forgave them. He did not fight them and cause bloodshed unnecessarily. And the contrasting with the end times of what the Christians claim to be the time when Jesus is going to rule for a millennia, for 1,000 years, and he's going to be brutal. He's going to take revenge against anyone who doesn't accept him, who does not acknowledge him as the Lord and as the warrior king. He's going to kill them all. Yes, and I think there are certain commentaries which make specific reference to the Jews, that he's going to kill them because they rejected him and they went against him and so on. So he's going to kill everyone who goes against Jesus Christ. And this is when he comes as strong. Remember, most of the history of what Jesus did in the New Testament, when he says turn the other cheek, love your enemy, this is only 3 years of his ministry, when he didn't have any army, did not have any power or anything like that. So it's I think it's a fair contrast between the two, and that was quite an important point to make.
That's a powerful point, and what I would add there is, I think this warlord thesis of every warlord we know in history, as soon as they get the upper hand, what do? Yeah, we see this in every political power struggle. And every new prime minister that comes in, every new president that comes in, every king, what do? They get rid of the old power base. They remove them, they destroy them, they kill them. Basically, there is no threat left. This is common practice across sort of modern political history, and actually worse, in pre-modern arenas, because that's how you maintain your position. And yet, when as you said, when in our own history, when this happened, 10,000 strong, walking into the people that persecuted him consistently over the previous 13 years and more, and he forgave them, even the one who killed his own uncle. And I think this really speaks to the point of, if he was doing this for personal gain, now was the time to gain. Right, that was the time to gain, and it didn't happen. So yeah, I fully agree with you. Fully agree there.
And at this point, I would like to play a small clip, which is actually Surat al-Fussilat, which is chapter 41, 33 to 36. So I'll quickly share my screen. Which is basically saying to repel evil with good. That's the central message, which is much more powerful than turning the other cheek. Because turning the other cheek means somebody gets hurt, Whereas forgiveness is not only good for your soul and your spirit, but also for the other person who has been forgiven. So it's something which is healing at the same time. Just one sec. Okay, here it is. Can see the screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Yeah, so it's a powerful passage in the Quran where, and this is not only in one place in Surah Fatiha, there's many places in the Quran where Allah says to repel the evil with good. Yes, so the person who might be your enemy, there'll be reconciliation between the hearts of the two people who were enemies before.
Alhamdulillah, mashallah. Sadaqallahu al-Azim. Okay, brothers. I think let's do. Are we going to open up for guests?
Yeah, I think we should be. We did say.
So while we're doing that, do you maybe want to just summarize the stream overall? Do you think it went well? Do you think if there's a future stream in the making? Are we going to have another discussion? What does the future hold for us? What do you think?
Was a question for me?
No, I think for Brother Sabur or Brother Sharif.
Okay.
Where do we take it now? Because this has received a lot of media attention, at least on social media. Where do you think this should go?
I think perhaps Sabur probably is in a better position because he knows Mohammed Hijab very well. He speaks.
Well,
to him
not just
often,
Mohammed Hijab. Do you think we should have more people engaging with Jordan Peterson, for example, other sort of intellectuals, for instance?
So there have been criticisms within the Muslim community, among certain sections within Muslims, of why we should be engaging with Jordan Peterson, because Jordan Peterson is seen as being right of the political spectrum within the West.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And sometimes the assumption is that Muslims tend to like Jordan Peterson because he's critical of, gender fluidity, talks about traditional values, patriarchy, that type of thing. Yeah. I think as Muslims, what we should do is we should engage with everyone, isn't it? Whether they're from the political left or the political right. The difference is that we should be presenting our own narrative, not trying to appeal to their positions or their narratives, whether that is, the ones on the left who are quite liberal and quite welcoming of Muslims, but maybe not of Islam, as opposed to the right who may be quite critical of Muslims, but at the same time have very traditional values which align with Islam. I think what we have the opportunity is to demonstrate that we have a unique civilization underpinned by this basis of this belief that's can be established and proven as best as inshallah, as best as possible for Muslims to approach it and understand it, and for non-Muslims as well, obviously, to understand it. So we have this, and that we have a very unique perspective about society, about the good life, about how the rules of life. Yeah. I said it to a couple of brothers. I said we should be writing a book on the rules of life because we have the best examples about how to live a good life. We don't have to really make it up. We don't have to do sociological experiments. We've got it within the Quran, and particularly within the Sunnah and the Seerah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and also exemplified by the Sahaba. So I think that's the way I think is the move forward, is that we develop our own narrative, and we present that as best as possible, to whatever wings or political wings that exist within the academia or the elite within society.
Jazakallah khairan. Thank you. Brother Sabur, your comments.
Jazakallah khair. Exactly like Sharif said, that we need to be engaging with everybody, whether they're on the left or the right. And also, I hope people see the intersection between what we could call the type of dawah that we're involved in, usually in Speaker's Corner, and also the political side, which clearly came out in this discussion. The whole thing about realism and about Islam's expansionism and Christianity and the West and this type of thing. And I think this element has been sort of neglected by Muslims for a long time. For example, if you're not aware of the history of colonization, of the neo-colonial project, or, for example, Sharif spoke about Uzbekistan and how it was colonized and by the Soviets, and what they basically did. And if we don't have those things ready within our minds, then when people like Jordan Peterson or others would be bringing up things like GDP or bringing up things about success and this type of thing, we'd be caught unawares. We just wouldn't know how to actually address this issue. Also, I think being aware of contemporary Islamic history, by contemporary I mean just even the neo-colonial times, just the last 30-40 years, it is very important, because we have to be able to articulate why the Muslim countries are in the state that they actually are. I mean, when Sharif was mentioning what's it called, Uzbekistan, and the horrific things that happened there, I remembered that one of the first times when I was a teenager, I was walking around, Cowley Road, Oxford, where I grew up, and I saw this thing on a lamppost, who killed Farhat Usmanov, right? And I was like, what is that? And this was a horrific situation where this person was killed. And as a Muslim, we're not politically aware of what's happening to other Muslims in other places. We're not aware of actually the colonization in the Muslim world has not ended. If you look at, for example, the Commonwealth countries, where do those people end up? They end up in London. Where are their children who are going to be future rulers? They're usually at Oxford and Cambridge, and they may not have the intellectual acumen to be in those institutions. So there's a whole, I mean, dawah is this dawah, I mean, this conversation between Peterson and Hijab, this shows how these things are interlinked, how the political side of things are interlinked. And even for Peterson, who's a pragmatist, the political side of things is almost as important for him as the theological side. And of course we wouldn't say that, but it just shows you how these things are interlinked and why we need to be polymaths. We can't just be stuck in our little...
I was just about to say that. I think, we have a rich history of scholars that are polymaths, and a rich history of I mean, the Quran itself is a multi-topical revelation.
Absolutely.
It talks about everything to do with the human condition, and at its essence, it really is, I think, I mean, I don't want to be trite when I say this, but I say, look, the revelation about what is the psychological being of existence was already revealed in the Quran 1400 years ago. So if you want to understand the psychology of the human being, read the Quran. These psychological texts and going after Freud and all this stuff, I mean, this is just man's attempt to understand what has already been revealed. I mean, I don't want to, like I said, I don't want to be too trite on this, but from our perspective, our worldview, this is how we view things. And I think everything you've said, absolutely right. We need to educate ourselves. We need to be more than just a single topic cog in the wheel, falling foul to the Western narrative, which is just get do a good degree or go to school, get a job, and live your life, and don't look sideways because it's not for you. Well, this is not the narrative of life. Life involves everything. And so I think, I mean, and like we said in the opening statements on credentials, you don't need to acquire a laundry list of degrees to educate yourself. Everybody today has access to knowledgeable individuals, has access to books, has access to knowledge. And it's just a question of everybody's got 24 hours. Just make the time. Nobody's got more than 24 hours. And if they have, can you let me know? Because I'd love to meet them. We've all got the same 24 hours. Inshallah, make the most of it. And it's a question of time management.
Can I also just make
yes,
really quickly, just to add to Sabboor's point? I've met a number of, not many, but, because there's not that many, but the number of people who've apostatized from Islam or who had doubts about Islam. And one of the central questions that I've even discussed with Mormons as well, one of the central questions that always seems to come up is, if Islam is so good, why in the Muslim world is there X, Y, Z going on? Yeah. Because you have to have a narrative, you have to have an explanation. Because if you don't provide an explanation, the understanding will be, well, it's because of Islam. Yeah. And I think that, just to re-emphasize Sabboor's point, is that you do have to have a level of understanding of history, of politics, in order to say, well, hold on, the reason what's occurring within the Muslim world is not because of Islam, it's because of the absence of Islam, and it's because of the colonial history and also the neo-colonial interference that we still see today. Yeah. Yes. And you have to provide that. And so I know there's like this reticence from a lot of people, or even resistance, to talk about politics in the context of the dawah. But I think it's actually very essential because they are interlinked, What
I would add there is and again, it's I think it's a very important distinction, which is we don't want to politicize the dawah, but let's ensure that we speak about the politics that's involved.
So I want to introduce, sorry to interject, I want to introduce a distinction which may be helpful. So when we're speaking about political realities, we're speaking about it in a descriptive way, not a prescriptive way.
Perfect.
Okay?
Yes.
And that would help. And the reason I brought up the issue of Uzbekistan is because this, I mean, obviously it came up earlier because even Peterson was having his book, spoken about there, that this shows, and a lot of Muslims don't know this, that colonization did not end, with the end of the British Empire, with the Indian partition and these types of things. That it's just literally, even now you have these satellite states, right? You have all of these things going on. So why are Muslims behind in Africa? Why are they behind in Central Asia? Why are they behind in these places? Each one of those places has a distinct history. Each one of those places has an interesting, set of variables that we can actually look at. And one of the interesting things, maybe we can do this in the future, is get Adnan on the podcast and speak about, firstly, this ridiculous link between Africa and poverty, and also, Usman Don Fodio, Sheikh Usman, yes, how his empire fought the British, and how they established themselves in the Hausa region, in the Fulani region until today. There's a strong identity of Islam, and missionaries have failed to convert those people. So we need, so these types of things, as long as they're discussed in a descriptive way, because what I keep away from is prescription, because people then start saying, oh, this is what you're trying to go for, and Muslims are trying to take over. And obviously that's not helpful at all. So I think adding that description's good. When doing
what I would, it brings to mind an interesting comment. So when you say colonization, it's important to understand that the majority of the southern nations that were colonized, whether they're Christian or Muslim or none, are actually in a situation of quite dire economic straits at the moment, right? Yeah. And it's nothing to do with religion, because you go to Latin America, that is predominantly Catholic, predominantly Portuguese, Spanish, and so on. You look at Africa, predominant and obviously, so to me, to say the Muslim countries are somewhat, you're forgetting the geographic and the political landscape they're living in has got nothing to do with necessarily the religion that they follow.
Yeah.
It's mostly to do with the fact that colonization sucked significant amounts of wealth and resource out of the area and spent it elsewhere. It didn't. It never sort of sent anything back. Pretty much.
And there's also an interesting story. I believe his name is Adi ibn Hatim, who lived at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, and it's either him or his son, and someone can fact check me in the comments about this, but one of the concerns before he became Muslim was he saw the Muslims as being really poor, right? And what he was told by the Prophet ﷺ was about how this was going to change. Now when I heard a explanation of this, what it is that it's not that he's attracted to the money. It's basically that people go where the strength is, right? If they see Islam and Muslims as weak and downtrodden and whatever, even if someone thinks Islam is true, it is something that can put people off. And maybe
that's a human reaction. Look, that's a normal human reaction, right?
Because maybe Peterson's pragmatism comes in here, and that's maybe why he's with the West, because they seem to be very successful.
Yeah, I mean, on a lighter note, I think just on a human perspective, everybody's looking for psychological safety, everybody's looking for personal security, and you ally yourselves with where you believe that to be. And if that happens to be in strength in numbers or strength in some other attribute, then that's what you align with, and that's got nothing to do with religion necessarily. It's to do with I want to be safe. I want to make sure I'm.
Surah Al-Nasr is an example of that. Surah Al-Nasr was revealed after the conquest of Mecca, and it talks about how they will enter into Islam in their droves, because Mecca was seen as the religious political center of the Arabian Peninsula. When that came under Islam, they realized, Islam must be true. Amongst the outlying tribes.
Yes, exactly.
It is the psychological state of human beings that, like you said, safety. They look at civilization, say, okay, what's the product of it? And I think, one thing I wanted to sort of mention as well, just as a quick add-on, is when Islam expanded in those first few hundred years, and then subsequent to that, you also had an expansion of new sciences, like the science of grammar, the science of Rasm script, the science of history, hadith, the science of looking at tafsir, exegesis, hermeneutical approach. You had usul al-fiqh, the science of jurisprudence. These are not just when we talk about the scientific age, we talk about generally the technology. They had that. But there was new types of sciences that were being created, and that became the standard by which the rest of the world started to understand certain things, like literature, like text, like critical studies in terms of history.
Exactly. So let's save that for another discussion, because I think we're sort of going way off this one. So have we opened up the lines, Brother Hashim? Do we have anybody coming in? You're on mute, brother.
So sorry, brothers, I'm going to have to go. Jazakallah khair for your time. It was a really good session.
Brother, thank you. Jazakallah. Thank you.
Barakallah feek, brother.
For your time and attention.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Right. I'm going to post the link quickly for the Q&A. So if anybody wants to jump in, there's a link in the video description. And I'm going to put the link in the chat as well, and obviously pin it.
Alhamdulillah. So there's been a lot of activity in the chat. Brothers, please join, or sisters as well, of course. Welcome, and ask any questions you may have.
Yeah, we didn't play the last part, did we? I think we should have played that last part.
Well, the last part was really the invitation to Oxford and Cambridge.
That was quite important, the way he received the message.
Okay,
I think Mohammed did play it, I think. Did he?
I did play it. I just stopped short.
Where he gets a bit emotional.
Right to the end. Okay.
No, he didn't actually.
Okay, well, let's save that for people to go and look it up and watch it. We don't want to give everything away here. I mean, I think we've had quite a big, long discussion.
Okay, so we got a few people.
Watch it. We don't want to give everything away here. I mean, I think we've had quite a...
Okay,
Marwan, could you close your tab, please? I think you've got 2 tabs open. We don't want to give everything away here.
Okay,
Marwan, could you close your tab, please? I think you've got 2 tabs open.
do you want to state where you're from and ask your question?
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa
Wa
alaikum
alaikum
salam.
wa barakatuh.
Yeah, so just in regards of the episode with Mohammed Hijab and Jordan Peterson, I wasn't following since the beginning of this live stream, but I just noticed that the conversation was kind of going like on many services. There was a service where the brother Mohammed Hijab was kind of answering the questions of Jordan, like just direct questions. But at the same time, I think he was really smart the way how he would like use that question to do dawah, right? Like he would just take 30 seconds, 1 minute, 2 minutes to answer the question, and just right after it, he would use it to do dawah, just to give to the, like as if he's addressing the audience itself. But on another service, there was like this debate going on at the same time, right? So like there was some push, Jordan was kind of pushing him to make statements against Islam and just prove, the love of Jesus Christ and how two religions, two biggest religions in the world, Christianity and Islam, they can live together while they have this approach of evangelizing, right? Because obviously, at least personally, I don't think Christians would accept living under an Islamic state, even if Muslims would guarantee them their rights, because Christians will still have this intentions of spreading Christianity within like a Muslim country, which is probably not allowed, I guess, under the.
Yeah, so brother, there's several topics there, and I think we need to eke out. So first of all, I think Brother Hijab, from my perspective, he was doing what I think is a model of a good response, which is we live in the world of social media where things can be taken out of context, and if you provide a partial answer, you can expect that to be potentially misused. So I think what Brother Hijab was doing was trying to provide a full and a complete an answer as possible within the context of the question that was being asked, which is why he did go on to try and and sort of wrap up each topic as completely as possible, which I think is good practice, by the way. I mean, we should do that in our own answers and discussions, which is if somebody asks you a question, don't just give them a partial answer, give them a complete answer. And if they don't have the patience to listen to the answer, then it means they were not serious about the question in the first place. So that was the first thing. I think the second thing, and I'll let the other brothers come in a second, I'll make quick comments, which is, yes, there may have been an element of evangelizing going on, but remember, this was a topic which was part of the topic of the discussion, because it was can we achieve, can Islam achieve peace? So therefore, it was within the context. It was quite right to be able to say, here's why Islam can make peace, and Jordan Peterson on the other side was saying, well, here's why Christianity, the position is, and they were obviously going into other secular topics as a result. So I don't see that as problematic personally. I just see it as being correct within the context of the topic that was being discussed. Brother Sharif, Hashim, any comments on that?
Yeah, I just wanted to. Sorry, Hashim, I don't know if you want to.
No, I don't have any. You can go ahead. And just want to emphasize that because there are a lot of people trying to join, the studio is full at present, so please don't try to join. And also, for those people who are asking questions, you have to limit your question to just one question and to the topic. Thank you.
Jazakallah. Thank you.
Okay. So I'll be really quick then, inshallah. I think maybe Jordan Peterson might present this as Islam versus Christianity, but I don't think it's Islam versus Christianity. I think it's liberal, secular, capitalist values that wants to impose itself. This is the thing. That's the thing that wants to impose itself, not just on an individual basis, but on a political basis across the world. The second issue is that Christianity in the West, and I think us brothers here, we all live in the UK. We know that Christianity is dying in the UK, in the West. There's increased numbers of people leaving Christianity in America. Churches are closing down in the UK. Hardly anybody goes to a church on Sundays. So I don't think Christianity is the issue. And I think maybe people like Jordan Peterson might like to look at this as Christianity West versus Islam, but really it's more secular liberal capitalism seeking to impose itself, and it has these sort of caricatures of what they perceive as the other, meaning the outside of that particular paradigm, and particularly the Muslim world. So so therefore, when it comes to the issue of Christians and would they be able to live with Muslims or live under the Islamic authority, I think they're under greater threat actually as Christians living under a secular authority than they would be under an Islamic authority. Yeah, because many of the secular values are impacting upon not just the fact that people are apostatizing, but also how they have to adhere to secular values in their own Christian religion. More discussions around gay priests, more discussions around women being within religious leaderships when it's previously considered prohibited, breakdown of family structures, all of these things that Christians themselves are facing. And so if you look at it from that perspective, then they're probably safer within the Islamic authority than they are within a secular one.
Yeah, like just an example of where Jordan was trying to, I'd say, score against Mohammed Hijab. For example, when Mohammed Hijab spoke about the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when he was hitting the rock and he would see this futuhat happening, and then Jordan Peterson was like, okay, so it stopped at the Christian countries. Like, why did it stop? Because Muhammad was kind of making this as a prophecy that Islam is going to spread all over the world. But then Jordan just threw it right there. It's, okay, so why did it stop at the Christian countries? He was trying to make a scope actually right there, I guess. And even if you listen to his intro, he was in the intro itself, like right from the beginning, he was really emphasizing on this peaceful, all-loving Jesus Christ versus the evangelizing system of Islam, right? So I'm not gonna say if it was like an honest conversation going on or dishonest, but I think he was trying to defend his perspective as well in regards of what Muhammad saying, what Muhammad was.
Which I mean, if we take a dispassionate view of the conversation, I think it's a fair position to take. I mean, I have a position, I have a view, I'm going to defend it, which is what he was doing. Now, we can look from the outside and say, was it right or wrong, and make a judgment call. But again, this is based on our worldview.
True.
And it is, I think, unrealistic to expect somebody to agree with everything you say. Otherwise, it's not a discussion.
He had a conversation with Ben Shapiro about because they agree on so many points, like when it comes to conservatives versus liberalism, all of those topics. But Ben Shapiro was really hitting on him in the sense that Christianity doesn't have any laws to make a country and all of those things, and it was really I would say even roasting Jordan Peterson when it comes to Christianity versus Judaism. And maybe Mohammed Hijab didn't really focus on this aspect that Christianity doesn't have any system in place to form a government and etc. Islam actually does. And if there is any system in the world right now where Christians would live peacefully and protect their rights and their traditions and everything, it would be under an Islamic state, not the West or any other system, I guess.
So, I mean, this is a very deep question. I think we don't want to go. I mean, I don't have time today to go into it. But what I would say is look, this was a very, very first step in building bridges on with an individual that has quite a distorted view of our world perspective, and I think. It is baby steps. Okay, it's and maybe if we're talking about this topic, let's say a decade down the road, we can say, look, let's be different. Let's sort of, you've got to. I mean, like most things, I think you've got to win the respect of the other side to be able to have the permission then to have hard conversations, and I don't think we've done that yet. And this is what this is. So my suggestion would be we need more brothers. Educated like Brother Hijab, rounded, polymath, aware of not only his Islamic background but also the secular sort of worldview, and to present it at least in a balanced perspective. We need more people like this, and we need more engagements. And if we increase the volume, inshallah, we will build those bridges, and we can have those hard conversations at some point.
Yeah, it's I actually agree with you, because as someone who lives in Canada, and you see you have two extremes, like you have the leftists and then the far right, and we are in a position where, for example, in the elections, you don't have many options. If you vote for the leftists, then your children will grow up learning about all of these, I'd say, like really.
No, yeah, exactly. So it's a lose-lose, and I think, as Brother Sharif said earlier on, it's important we build our narrative, an informed narrative, and we make sure that we deliver that in a manner that is respectful, understanding, and coherent.
Yep.
Jazakallah.
Right.
Thank you, brother.
Barakallah feek, Brother Marwan.
Barakallah
Thank
feek.
you. Right, we got not that person. Okay. So, Brother Ahmad, welcome back.
Yeah, thank you, Sam. You can hear me?
Yes.
Very, very clearly, yes. How are you?
Oh, thank you. I'm very good. After speaking to you last time, I was so impressed. I want to build a bridge. It's like, and
Fantastic.
of course, today's topic was more of a political nature. Okay, but as I said that mostly, I want to more focus on spiritual nature of Islam. Okay, because what happens is that in politics there is always a blame game. As I saw in the discussion also, the Christians, they will blame Islamic conquest, or the Hindus will blame Islamic conquest. So everybody keeps blaming, oh, you did this, and then he will say, oh, before that you did that. So this blame game never. So I want to keep this politics aside. Okay.
So what is your definition of politics in this kind of conversation? Because when you say politics, do you mean like governance?
Yeah. So what happens is that this is the nature of this world. Some kings will come, politician leaders will come, according how God empowers them. Okay. And then
just to tell you, in Islam we do not like separate governance. It's part of our religion. Okay, because only God can tell us what is the best form of governance, whether it's within politics, whether it's within your social life, or whatever it is, you see. So the way you're saying this is spiritual and this is politics, that kind of distinction, state and religion was also made in Europe. And I think that is where you're coming from, that it has to be separate. Otherwise, it's not something that's ordained by God. But in Islam, it's not such. In Islam, it's very much part and parcel of our faith, our religion. So the spiritual nature is there within the governance as well, within the politics, provided it's followed obviously from the perspective of what the Sharia defines it as. Does that make sense?
Yeah, exactly. But then this politics, even if God has to govern this world, God has given. There is no doubt about it. There is a spiritual aspect when we connect that politics to God. But then ultimately, this politics is limited to this world, because when we hereafter, when we will be with God, so there is no connection to this politics of this world. It is completely different. So
let me come back on that point, Brother Ahmad. So look, from our belief system, the lawgiver is Allah, right? He's the one that makes the laws. He's the one that gives the law. We follow the law. Now, we have laws to govern our earthly existence, and we have laws to govern our post-earthly existence, the afterlife. Okay, and we must follow all of those in order to be right in terms of the laws that are being given. So this is why we must. This is why the discussion that Brother Hijab had. He mentioned it very clearly. He started off by saying, "We believe in God." This is our foundation, which means when we believe in God and we can, again, our paradigm, we have very, very good reasons to believe what has been revealed is the absolute truth. And we have this idea of absolute truth and absolute morality.
Yeah.
There are things that are absolutely wrong and absolutely right. And we base all of our governance of life and of this life and the hereafter based on that. So we don't separate them. The separation of church and state was a concept that came out of the Enlightenment period, when there was a fight with the Catholic Church, essentially, right? This is not a paradigm that we have. It's non-existent
Yeah.
for us.
So what happens is that the politics is an identity, bodily identity. Suppose, for example, I am from India. So it is giving me an Indian identity. Suppose somebody is from America. So this politics gives you a bodily identification, and that can be multiple
Okay, so
identification.
only
So, but the soul has no. It's only the servant of God, right?
I agree.
Servant
Yeah,
of Allah, isn't it?
Yeah.
So
Look,
it's politics, or its duty is to serve Allah or serve God, and all this politics he has to leave behind because it is limited to this world.
well, we do not believe that. So for example, I mean, let me give you a very simple example. When we stand up to pray, we pray 5 times a day. This is the requirement for every Muslim. We are told to pray with our eyes open. Why? Because you must concentrate on your salah while recognizing that the world around you still exists. We don't have this idea of closing the eyes and just meditating and locking out the world. So this is actually an example where 5 times a day, when we stand up in prayer, we deliberately separate ourselves from this reality while still being in it. And this is practice that you have to say, this is what, there's no separation here. So what I would say is, look, very respectfully, the perspective you have is not our paradigm. Our paradigm is different, and we have good reasons for believing why we have what we have. And as I said, we invited you onto another stream. You know, hopefully we can have this discussion on that stream.
Yeah,
We appreciate you joining.
One last few minutes, please. Few minutes. One question.
Only one question, brother. That was a
No. 1 minute. Just I want to ask. Suppose, do you believe that there is injustice in this world?
Of course.
Of course, there's
yeah,
injustice.
that is what like, for example, if you say that there is injustice in the world, that means in the creation of Allah or creation of God, there is injustice. Okay, so that is a blasphemy, because you are accusing Allah or accusing God that in his creation there can be injustice, and where there is injustice happening, he's just sitting and he is not correcting.
Right.
So
No, but this is another way of saying. This is another. Sorry. So this is another way of saying, because there's evil, we can't do X, Y, Z. Right.
Exactly.
This is a different discussion. This is not what was discussed on this stream today.
So, Ahmad, what is your position? Do you think there is injustice in this world, according to you?
No, because God cannot do injustice. Everyone is suffering his own actions.
Okay, so when Rama's wife was taken by Ravan, was that injustice?
Yeah, injustice, but one has to differentiate between the Lord's pastime, Lord, because he says that what is that, Bhagavad Gita, Janma Karma Chame Divyam, my birth and my activities you cannot compare to a normal human being. Okay, so when something happens, he has the power. If there is some injustice also, because God has done that there is a justice hidden behind that.
No, but
a normal
I'm not talking
person,
about Ram. I'm talking about Ravan. Has Ravan done injustice? Don't tell me he was God.
So, Brother Ahmad,
so
respectfully,
we don't
let's
say
have this discussion
God,
on the other stream.
We should have this on the Hinduism.
Let's have this on our Hindu stream.
I
really want to have this discussion
welcome,
with you. We do. But let's have it on that stream. This is not the right stream for that.
Okay,
thank you very much.
All right, thanks a lot.
Thank you so much for joining, by the way. Yeah, great to have you here.
He's a nice chap.
He is. Yeah.
Okay. Left. Okay. Go on. Assalamu alaikum warahmatullah.
Hello, walaikum assalam, brothers. How are you?
Walaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi
Alhamdulillah.
wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah, very well. How are you, brother?
Yeah, you guys are very brave because you're taking live calls. Because I've seen most of Muslim scholars, they are scared of taking live calls. So I appreciate.
So, brother, we are not scholars. Okay, let's make that clear. We're just average individuals that are having a nice chat online, right?
Yeah.
Do not take anything.
Where are
we
you
say as
calling
a
from,
proof.
Gulzar?
Yes, I'm in USA, and another, I think, brother Mohammed showed honesty. He said it's not a scholar because, otherwise people lie, oh, we are scholar, and they're not scholars. So truly, I appreciate for your integrity. So, no offense. I won't be very much negative about the conversation because if you are giving me respect, I would do the same thing. But as you know that a lot of people are leaving Islam, and you guys are also working hard to make them believe that Islam is true. So again, this is narrative from your side and from the other side, right? So now the problem comes if you would like to mention that you guys are taking all benefits from the secular societies. I believe you all invest, I'm also invest. But when we talk about the defense of Islam, you see that I don't speak Arabic, but the creator of universe sent the book in Arabic language, like Quran. Second, if I read the Quran, it doesn't show that it can be written by some supernatural being. I can show you a lot of verses which look like that 7th century. Third thing, that one side that we say that follow the Sunnah of Muhammad, but Hazrat Muhammad, peace be upon him, had 11 wives. So why not we 11 wives? Why just 4 wives? So, there are a lot of contradictions, and I can go on. But
Yeah.
I won't.
Before you go on, I want to just
my 3
specify.
questions. Yes, sir.
Gulzar, I did specifically say only one question, did I not? Okay. So you need to understand not only one question, but it has to be related to the topic.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I understand. What was the topic? I can quickly ask the question about the topic. I think God, if you just briefly say what was the topic.
You don't know what the topic was?
Did you listen to the stream today? We just spent almost 3 hours discussing.
Yeah.
Did you spend 3 hours with us or not?
I did listen some part, but if you say
I'm
one
asking,
title.
Did you listen to the whole of our discussion today or not? Or did you join
not
in the last
whole.
5 minutes?
Okay.
Look, respectfully, I'm very sorry, but we had a very, very deep, in-depth discussion today on a broadcast that took place between 2 individuals. That's the topic of today's discussion, not some random topics that you may want to pose. If you want to post those, there's a multitude of forums out there that you can post them onto.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
I understand.
Okay. So we specifically said keep it relevant to the topic and only one question at a time. So there are a lot of people waiting in the background there. So we have to be fair to everyone.
Exactly. Yeah. So.
Atif Ali Bhatti.
I think it's frozen.
Yeah, I think it's frozen. I'll take the next caller. Okay, Adam Shabir.
Assalamu alaikum, brothers. How are you?
Alaikum salam.
Wa alaikum salam, brother.
Yeah.
Alhamdulillah. How are you?
Where are you joining from, Adam?
I'm joining from London.
Oh, okay, that's good. Yeah. And your question is relevant to the topic, I'm assuming?
Yes, no, it is. It will be, inshallah.
Okay.
No, it will be. So I have to be fully honest. I hadn't heard the whole 3 hours of your conversation. I did come a bit late, so forgive me if you have touched on this. So I will ask 2 generally short questions. So the first one would be, when listening to the podcast, and I listened to it in its entirety between Mohammed Hijab and Jordan Peterson, there was a moment where Jordan Peterson was talking about arguments from instinct or the Fitra being more powerful or more practical than arguments from, let's say, propositional arguments. So I was wondering what your thoughts on that would be. And then a second point would be, or question rather, that would one thing you.
Okay. Yeah. Go ahead. We can hear you now. Yeah. I think there's some connection issues.
Can you repeat your second question, please? We
so I think I was connected there.
Yeah.
So if you were on the podcast with Jordan Peterson yourself, you would want to say to him personally, or something you would want us to take away, what would that be?
Brother Sharif, Fitra, and what would you say to Jordan Peterson?
Yeah. So Fitra is a very detailed and in-depth discussion. It's not a simple discussion when we talk about the Fitra, or innate disposition, and what do we mean by Fitra. It's a really big topic area. I think what we want to say is this: we want to say that there is something natural within human beings that naturally, affirms the existence of a creator. The very fact that we talk about the existence of a God that's not natural, that's beyond, the supernatural, beyond the natural world, that even the idea requires an explanation as to how the idea came into our head. Because if everything we experience is natural, then how is it that we come to a conclusion about something that's not natural? Yeah, it's not natural to think about things that are not natural. Yeah, so there's various arguments, transcendental arguments, which sort of involve arguments around Fitra. For me personally, I think irrespective whether you use a Fitri argument or come to the existence of the creator through the Fitra or innate desire, there is going to be some sort of rationalization process that you're going to have to use. So you're going to have to rationalize why you trust your Fitra, as an example, as opposed to something else. Now, does that mean, therefore, that the rationalization process of every individual has to be at a level where we have to understand syllogisms and deductive logics and different forms of logic, all of these things? No, I don't think you need to know that. For example, and I give this example many times, if you see a painting of the Mona Lisa, automatically you know there is a painter that painted it. Now, if I was to ask you why, what is your rationalization reasoning process? Most people are going to struggle. Most people are going to be able to struggle and talk about why they come to this, because I can't really appeal to empiricism, because at the end of the day, empiricism, you've not seen the person painting it because it's the Mona Lisa. Then there's questions about analogies. How do you analogize between seeing somebody painting something and this, and what's the connection between the two? What I'm trying to get at is that there's complexity when you try to explicitly explain something that automatically in your mind is rational, i.e. there is a painter for the painting, or an author for the book. You could go into a discussion about contingency and the fact that these are contingent properties and that you need an efficient cause, all that type of thing. So there is a level of rationalization that we are born with, that we have a capacity to use, and that concludes the existence of a creator. However, what's happening at this moment in time is that there are people who will come out with arguments to subvert our sort of innate fitri ideas about believing God, and also some of our basic rational axioms that come to the conclusion of God. And therefore, we have to go into a bit more detail and discuss this in a bit more depth. So in short answer, yes, we all use a form of rationalization. Even those who, adhere to the fitr, you have to rationalize that. Obviously, the best way is to use the mind with this innate desire that worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that complements each other, and that therefore comes to the conclusion that Islam is true and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala exists. And that's the best position to be, inshallah. So it is a deep discussion, sorry.
No, I see.
Yeah, I don't know if you want me to answer the second question. The second question was again, sorry?
So the second question was, if you were on the call yourself with Jordan Peterson, if there was one thing you wanted to say to him.
Yeah, I think I would probably, my personal approach might have been at the beginning, because I was thinking about this, and everything's more clear 2020. They say hindsight's 2020. Yeah, so it's all what you reflect upon at the time. So I was thinking that perhaps what I would do is I wouldn't really go into the arguments for the existence of the creator, like going into contingency arguments, but I would talk about how we as Muslims approach, how the Quran and the Sunnah pushes us to approach these questions about the existence of the creator, and that we need to establish for ourselves some sort of rational justification and conviction in our belief system, that we don't just simply accept it through blind emotional following of other people and other generations. That's condemned within the Quran. And in fact, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, numerous verses of Quran talk about reflection of nature, reflection of the universe, that these are signs, ayat, for those people who think. So I would emphasize that point, because again, I think knowing where Jordan Peterson's coming from, I think he has this impression that, you know, outside of the Western world, they're just, you know, irrational type of individuals. And I think to explain to him some of the verses of Quran that talk about the importance of the use of the mind, I think might be quite enlightening. But, you know, alhamdulillah, Mohammed Hijab did a fantastic job anyway.
Yeah.
Indeed.
Fully
Okay.
agree.
Thank you, Brother Adam.
Thank you. Jazakallah for your
Thank you.
time.
Barakallah
Thank you.
feek.
Assalamu alaikum.
Yes, rahmatullah. Okay, Brother Atif. Oops, same problem again.
Oh,
Oh,
here we
yeah,
go. No, he's there.
works fine.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, Assalamu alaikum rahmatullah.
That's-
We can hear you, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I really want to congratulate you for this.
Barakallah feek. You're breaking up, brother. I don't think your connection is... Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead. Give it a try again.
I'm from Pakistan, and I have a very specific question.
We can't hear you, brother. Your connection is poor. Maybe you can write it in the chat and we'll try to answer that, inshallah, yeah?
Yeah, we can't
Just-
hear you, brother. We're really sorry. We
Yeah.
cannot hear you at all.
Just write down your question in the chat and we'll try to answer.
Thank you. Jazakallah khair.
Okay. Brother Adnan.
Oh, sorry.
Assalamu alaikum warahmatullah.
I also joined late, so I apologize if this came up already. But in the podcast, I remember they touched upon, you know, obviously the topic of when Jordan Peterson had previously called Prophet ﷺ a warlord, and you know, Mohammed Hijab really honed in on that point and really showed him like the bias in why he chose to use those words when he hadn't really described anybody else. You know, much worse people in this world to get that title. So I was kind of wondering, why do you guys think that this idea of violence in Islam is so prevalent in people as educated as him, and sort of how, I guess, I'm not really sure what my second part of the question is, mostly how we can educate ourselves in order to talk to people about these kind of things.
Yeah, good question. Brother Muhammad.
You know, it's a tough question, first of all.
Yeah.
Why does any biased opinion form in the first place? Right?
Mhm.
I think we need to ask ourselves this. And how do you know it's biased when you have an opinion that is biased? I mean, it's a very difficult thing to stand outside your paradigm and analyze your paradigm. It's actually impossible. Thomas Kuhn has said it's impossible, right? You cannot validate another paradigm while still staying in your own paradigm. You have to actually dissolve, remove, destroy your existing one to understand the other one. Intellectually, I'm not saying, you know, but let's just understand that. So I think it's a question of, we don't know what intellectual cages we are born into. And we also then don't know that we need to come out of that cage. And we also don't know, you know, the nature-nurture debate in terms of how much of that cage is being nurtured onto you and how much of it is just essentially part of the makeup of the community that you're born into and is taken as common knowledge or understanding. So I think the question there isn't one of, let's not criticize somebody for having a worldview that is mistaken from our paradigm. Let's build a bridge to be able to at least get them to recognize there is another paradigm. And then let's see if they can come across that bridge and at least stand on the other side. That would be my response.
Yeah, I think
Brother Sharif.
biases apply to everyone because they're
Yes.
influenced by so many different factors, isn't it? By your friends, by the environment you live in, by the people you associate with, by the resources that you go by, what books you read. I mean, there's a plethora of factors I can think of. But I think in this day and age, in the age of information, ignorance is a choice. So if you really want to find out the correct information, you would know, I mean, a person in Dr. Peterson's position would know the right people to go to. And maybe he hasn't had the opportunity. I don't know. I'll give him the benefit of the doubt for that. So yeah, it could be several factors, but I think biases play a role in everyone's life, I guess. I don't think anyone's completely free, but it's something that we can minimize, I would say. But yeah, it's especially if you don't know about Islam, there are so many resources today. It's no more an excuse. Like that hadith Brother Hijab mentioned in the podcast, it says Islam will enter every house, every home. Yes. And this could be the meaning, like you have information about Islam at your fingertips, being on the internet. So it's something that could be the meaning of that. There could be other meanings to that.
Yeah, I was also going to just make, all what Brother Mohammed and Hashim said about biases and about being in cages, absolutely true in terms of that. I would say there's a few things, though. I do think that it is a lazy caricature of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and Islam. Yeah, and I think, you would expect this. I think this is what probably hurts a lot of Muslims, is that we would expect somebody like Jordan Peterson, very educated person, would probably have a better appreciation. I think then that goes back to what Muhammad said, which is that sometimes we don't realize what type of environment and particular perspective that person's come from, his own experiences, that has formed these particular biases. Yeah. The second issue in terms of biases themselves and how to try to overcome them even within amongst ourselves, what I try to do is I try to be able to steelman an opposing position. Yeah, meaning to be able to argue the position that contradicts my position better than the person who believes in it. Yeah, if I think I've got that ability to do that, and yet still reject the argument and the idea, then I think I'm pretty sure about the idea that I have. And certainly with a lot of discussions that I've had with atheists and secularists and other people, but particularly with atheists, I actually probably think that I probably could argue their position better for atheism than they themselves they could. So I think that's the issue, and I think that means that if I'm looking into Islam, and maybe this isn't, if there are non-Muslims watching today, if you're looking into Islam, or if I'm looking into Islam and I'm not a Muslim, then the best way to look into Islam is to try to think, why do Muslims believe in this? How could I steelman? How could I try to argue for Islam, better than a Muslim? And let me try to research Islam in that light. Because if you research Islam in that light, I think you'll have a better appreciation as to why Muslims believe in it. Whether you become Muslim or not, or accept it, it's a separate issue. But at the very least, you'll have an appreciation as to why Muslims adopt the belief of Islam. If you come with that mindset, as opposed to coming to the mindset of, I'm going to criticize it, I'm going to look for all the negatives, and therefore all the negatives are highlighted in your head. Even though for us as Muslims, when we look at the Sirah of the Prophet ﷺ, actually the majority of the time of the Sirah of the Prophet ﷺ that highlights amongst us are the positives, are the mercy, those things which are quote unquote seen as negative, like the warfares, they are significant, but they're also seen within a particular context, and in fact are actually a positive, because for us, they teach us about warfare, they teach us about mercy as well, and they teach us about when certain rules need to be enacted at what particular period of time, and how to therefore fulfill it in the best possible way. And obviously we're talking about a time where there was no charter about how to engage in warfare, and yet the Prophet ﷺ laid out very clear obligations and rights and responsibilities on the army and upon the people who were considered enemy combatants.
Yeah. Thank you for the answer. MashaAllah. May Allah bless you guys.
Thank you. Right, we got one more brother.
I think we'll make this the last caller, brother. Yeah. It's getting rather late. Yeah.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum
Wa
salam.
alaikum salam, brother. You're very faint. Can you speak up, please, a little bit?
Do you hear me now?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
Where are you joining from, and what's your question?
I am from Egypt.
Okay. Fadal.
Excuse me, can you understand Arabic? As my English is a little bit weak.
No.
Your English is quite good. Come on, you can manage it.
But this is an English program, so we need to make sure for our audience
Yes,
that we
yeah,
speak English only.
yes,
Jazakallah.
I it's an English program, but I think Brother Hashim could speak a little bit Arabic, so he can help
No, but
me.
you speak English quite well, brother. Please, for the benefit of all the people, it'll be good if you ask the question in English.
Okay. I didn't join the stream from the beginning. I just see your tweet about stream, and I came here to say you make a good job in da'wah. Bismillah, mashallah.
Barakallah feek, yeah.
Barakallah feek.
Did you have a specific question related to the stream?
Yes, I have. Let's say an argument in my head, and I want to consult you as you have a good run in dawah field. May
Okay.
I?
As long as it's related to the topic, we will go ahead with that.
I think it's related to topic. It's a field in. It's an argument about da'wah in other non-Muslims such as Christian and Jewish. I said that
You need to speak up.
We can't hear you, brother. You're very, very, very faint.
Yeah.
Okay. The Bible isn't preserved, and all the writer of Bible are anonymous. How can any sane person in the land follow book who is written by anonymous people? This is the argument. Yeah. For example, if my teacher, if my professor in college tell me that I will send you a book to study and you have exam tomorrow, and somebody in my class came and say and he's the best one in our class, say the professor give us the book, give me the book, study this. Somebody in the class say, I have this book since three years before, written by somebody. I don't know his. I don't know who it is, but his name is, for example, Luke. Study this book, and you will pass the exam. Who I would follow? Which book I will read? The honest man in my the best man in my class, or the anonymous man who read this book? You get the argument?
Yeah, we do get your
We
argument,
understand.
but it's still off topic. It's nothing related to the topic.
Yeah. So
I think it's related to topic because what Dr.Jordan Peterson is a well-educated man. How could the well-educated man not think like this about this idea? He followed the book which his writer is anonymous. Nobody know who's Luke, who's Mark, who's Matthew, who's John. Nobody, no one know who is this guys. Or even
Yeah,
in
but
the
he
Old
didn't.
Testament.
Did he actually refer to any biblical passages
he didn't. He did not.
during the stream? I don't think he did.
No.
Why don't you join? This is a good question. Look, brother, I'm not saying it's not, but maybe save it for another stream where we do discuss Christianity, the Bible, or maybe join the arena on EF Dawa where they entertain such questions.
Yeah, so there is another channel, EF Dawah, that Brother Hamza runs, where he specifically addresses those questions. And in fact, he's actually answered this question several times already.
Yeah. But
Jazakallah khairan for your question. It is a beautiful question, but unfortunately not relevant for this stream.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, barakallah.
Thank you. Barakallah.
Okay.
Right. I think that was the last.
Yes.
Yeah, the last guest. So we're going to close taking any more Q&A questions. Maybe just do a quick wrap up maybe. Just before we do the wrap up, I just wanted to remind everyone who have enjoyed this stream to do like, share, and subscribe. And also we have a Patreon. If you wanted to contribute financially to help the Dawah, we have a Patreon, and also to join as a member. The links for all of this is in the description of the video and also on our website, DawahWise.com. Yeah, I mean, that's it from me. Brothers, you guys want to give some
Brother Sharif?
Yep.
No, Jazakallah khair for having me on, and alhamdulillah, I've enjoyed the stream as well.
No, thank you for
yeah,
joining at the
Jazakallah.
last minute as
Indeed,
well.
yeah.
We
You
do
were
appreciate it
No.
very much. Yeah.
very valuable
Inshallah.
indeed. Yeah. We had
Yeah.
other brothers. Unfortunately, they couldn't join today. I believe Brother Yusuf Pondus was going to join as well. He couldn't make it. So lots of last minute changes. So you were godsend.
Qadar Allah. Yeah, Qadar Allah.
Yeah,
Exactly. Brother Mohammed?
Yeah, so I would just say, as we've discussed today, this is the beginning, hopefully, of more such discussions, and inshallah, we'll follow them, we'll bring them to your attention, and of course, please give us any feedback on your own opinions. This video will be posted. Please do comment and tell us maybe anything we missed and any mistakes that we made. If we did, then we're only human at the end of the day, and we are all bound to make mistakes. So please do forgive us.
Inshallah. I mean, okay. Jazakallah khair, brothers and sisters. Inshallah, we'll have another stream next week. So keep an eye out on our channel on DawahWise, and also do subscribe to Brother Sharif's channel. Is it Thought Adventure Podcast? TAP?
That's right. Thought Adventure Podcast. Yeah, inshallah.
Okay, inshallah, we'll put a link in the description later on.
It's a fantastic channel, by the way. I watch it regularly.
And please do subscribe. I'm surprised they don't have many subscribers, but it's an invaluable channel. A lot of what do you say, brothers over there who are well educated, dealing with mainly atheists and also I think Christians. So alhamdulillah, do subscribe and share the channel as well and help them to grow. Jazakallah khair. Okay. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Nahmadu wa nusalli ala rasulil kareem. Amma ba'd.